Hello, this is Matthias Goertz. Welcome to my monthly COVID-19 update. As always, I will share my screen with you. So, I've titled this Homo Homini virus. Virus is Latin, it means something like poison or something toxic. So it's not really that appropriate because SARS-CoV-2 is not toxic. But nevertheless, it seems that humanity has become its own best virus. And I thought I use that as a title, obviously derived from the traditional saying Homo homini lupus, which is men is men's wolf. So now men is men's virus. I want to start, as always, with a little meditation, and I wanted to meditate on a few lines from a song that I loved very much when I was young. I still love it today. The Logical Song by Supertramp. Some of you may know the song. I'm not going to sing it for you. This is the sort of the second set of lines of the song. It starts, when I was young, it seemed that life was so wonderful, a miracle, oh, it was beautiful, magical, etc. You will recall, right? So let's meditate on these lines. And let's just take 3 deep breaths. Okay, so I suppose we've now all signed up for our SARS-CoV-2 tests and our contact tracing and our vaccinations, and we are now all very respectable and presentable vegetables. With that, welcome. Scenarios, yeah, no change. Guess what? I'm just changing now the months at the bottom there because we are not moving anywhere at the moment, right? Deep into the fractured world. As I said last time, going forward, that will be interesting given the vaccines have now arrived. I said in January or even already in December that there was actually a plausible scenario in which by July 2021, the world would be back in what we called early spring, meaning we would have a concerted, effective global response. Namely, if countries around the world, or at least the main countries, had agreed to administer vaccinations to those people who really are at risk, which is, elderly and a few others who have preconditions. Because it was conceivable as of December, as of January, that by July there would have been enough vaccines available, produced, distributed for all people around the world who really, reasonably can be said to be at least at some risk, that is sort of some significant risk, which is probably somewhere between, let's say 15 and 20% of the world population, that all of those people could have received at least the first jab by July. That was not implausible. Secondly, I said, well, if some significant countries insist on aiming the vaccine not at those at risk primarily, but at the entire population or at other groups within the population that aren't actually at risk, so, squandering the vaccine basically, then in July we would still be pretty much exactly where we are today, right, in the fractured world. Thirdly, I said, in a sort of worst case, in the short term, we might get into distribution battles over the vaccine, either between countries or even within countries, leading to civil, conflicts and unrest, etc. That would have brought us even further down, even deeper into the fractured world scenario than we already are today. So those were the three kind of plausible outlooks, 6 months kind of outlooks I suggested a month or two ago. Now, I think it's very clear where we are at the moment. It now looks very likely that the second of these three scenarios, will play out, which is by July will be still pretty much where we are today. There will be some local improvements in that the vaccinations are going ahead and they will start having an effect. But as a global community, we will not have moved very much by July. That's how it looks to me now. And that's because there are a significant number of countries who still have this ideology of being at war with the virus, and their primary goal not actually being to either protect people or protect people's livelihoods or protect people's rights. Those obviously are lowest in the hierarchy for apparently everybody, but to defeat the virus. There are still a number of governments that seem to have that as their KPI that they measure themselves on, the key performance indicator, right? And if that is the case, then you don't necessarily target the vaccine. When you have it, first of all, you may not actually be so quick with the vaccines because, those governments which have anyways taken all rights and our livelihoods away already, they don't really have anything, no urgency. Now they will say, oh, we're already keeping the virus low. So, vaccination isn't so urgent for us. So you may see countries that aren't even making an effort to get the vaccination because they don't think it's a problem to suppress their populations. Right? But even where they get the vaccines, they may then not give it to those who really need it. So you're seeing on a daily basis right now, you're seeing governments announcing that they're giving the vaccines first to healthcare workers. Now that's very nice, but the healthcare workers are usually in their prime age, some maybe up to 60, and they're not particularly vulnerable to becoming severely ill with this virus. They may be more exposed to receiving the virus. That's true. And of course, the more you're exposed, the more there is at least a small likelihood that you then get very sick from it. But the vast majority of healthcare workers will never get severely sick from this. So while I understand that people have them on their mind, they're not the most important group, right? Then it gets better. Frontline workers is a term that I hear a lot. When you then ask, well, what the hell is that? And then you see things like, police and armed forces in some countries. These are men in their prime. They are not very likely to have a compromised immune system, right? So, but, there may be interest groups, right? So, lobbying groups, there are certain strata of society that are more equal than others, right? Because they have more lobbying power. Or they are, in fact, supporting those in power or whatnot. So you see a lot of countries not giving the vaccine to those who actually really need it, right? So, which is a way of squandering it, not entirely, because of course, even if you give it to other people, it will reduce the proliferation of the virus. So indirectly give some protection to those who need it, right? But indirectly, as opposed to directly, right? So it's an ineffective way of protecting those who really need protection. But countries have been doing exactly that for the last 9-10 months, protecting those who need it in an indirect way by hammering down on everybody else. So it's not maybe that's surprising that they're not changing their mind now that they have the vaccine. So they're just continuing the same approach now that they have the vaccine. So another thing is that a lot of countries, or at least for some of the vaccinations, they're only administering it to the 18 to 59-year-olds. In some cases, the vaccinations weren't actually tested for 65 and older, which is the main target group, which is astounding, right? I mean, I understand the rationale. The risks are higher, so those who produce those vaccines say, oh, we're going to test it on those who are anyways healthy, so the risk of side effects is, of course, lower. Yeah, of course, and then we get our vaccine approved faster. That's fantastic, but you haven't tested the thing on those who really need it. So your vaccine, in some sense, is quite useless, right? It's not entirely useless, but it's much less useful than it could have been, right? So now the EU has said AstraZeneca, for example, isn't suitable for 65 and older because it hasn't been tested. So anyways, and there are some countries who even deliberately have a strategy to say, no, we're not giving it to the elderly because the elderly are not so mobile and active in the society anyways, which is true. We're giving it to those who are most active in the society, right? And that's the sort of the working population. So they're clearly using it to create some kind of herd immunity, as opposed to using it to protect those who actually need protection. There's also, I think, globally, an indifference to gender, even though it is very clear statistically that males are much of the same age. I showed a statistic 6 months ago or 5 months ago. Males are much more vulnerable than females at the equivalent age. A male at 65 is about as vulnerable as a woman at 75. Right? So if one was serious about protecting those who statistically are most at risk, one would clearly differentiate between the genders. But countries aren't doing that. Now, they may implicitly say, well, there would be discrimination, but they have had no problem discriminating between, or not discriminating 1% who fall ill and the 99% of the world population who are unaffected by this virus, right? I mean, this lack of clarity, about what needs to be done to get out of this mess is just astounding. This is not a moment to say, oh, we cannot discriminate between genders. Nature discriminates between genders. Right? Females live longer and they're healthier, statistically, right? And not each individual, but statistically. And this is all about statistics, right? This is all about understanding where are the vulnerable groups and how do we get them protected as quickly as possible, right? We could have done all of these things right, and then by July, we would basically be done. But we're not. As I say, in July, we'll be exactly where we are today. Now, from there, where do we go from there? Let's say by December of this year, I mean, some people are hoping that maybe by the end of this year, we'll have some kind of normality again. Could we be in the early spring by December, if not by July? And the answer is, well, yeah, if enough governments learn that you have to apply this vaccine to those people who need it, and not to everybody else, right? At least not to start with. Some countries who can afford it and who have the means and the competence may be able to, like Britain said, they will vaccinate the entire adult population by the autumn. If things go well, maybe they can, right? And some other countries, but I'm talking here about the global perspective. The UK may then say we are done, but if their neighbors don't say we are done, then they still can't travel. Right? So the whole world has to get through this, not just some bits and pieces of the world, right? So some countries will get through this year, I have no doubt, but the question is, will the world as a whole by December be in the early spring? And it could, I mean, just as it could have in July, and it could, of course it could, but I'm just not seeing that people actually want to. So we'll see. I'm keeping my eyes on it and see what happens. So I would say, yeah, there's a possibility that we are in early spring by December, but it's by no means guaranteed, right? It is just as plausible that by December 2021, we are still where we are today. If, so, for example, we find that the vaccines don't prevent transmission, and if countries insist on herd immunity via vaccinations, mind you, I will talk about it again later, many countries will have reached herd immunity naturally anyways by that time, but the governments may not know that, or they may not believe it, or they may not want their people to know it, right? So, because, then reaching herd immunity naturally just does mean you have run through the thing with all the natural fatalities that, the IFR would have predicted, right? Meaning you have not had a lower than predicted IFR. So the governments may fear to actually admit that they have reached natural herd immunity because they may fear it makes them look bad in the eyes of their voters. Right? Why didn't you do more? Why didn't you lock down even more, right? Yeah, many countries will reach natural herd immunity, but they will not either know it or not want to know it. So they will still, some of them will still insist on using the vaccines for so-called herd immunity. And if they then find that those vaccines are not very effective on the level of transmission, I have no doubt that they're effective on the level of preventing severe symptoms and disease, which is exactly what we need. So I'm very optimistic about these vaccines, right? This is not about the virus, and this is not about the vaccines, right? The virus is, as I said many, many times, is harmless, and the vaccines are effective. I mean, this is such a simple virus. It's not, obviously not very difficult to get these vaccines done. I mean, by now we have a proliferation of them, which suggests it's not very difficult. I mean, this is not HIV or some really tricky and dangerous virus, right? It is a harmless virus, easy to understand, easy, therefore, to create a vaccine. So we'll be swamped with vaccines. But this is no longer, and they will be harmless. So don't worry about taking it, just take it, right? Because your governments will force you to take it anyway, just take it, right? It won't do any harm to you, right? It will be less risky still than the virus itself for those who are at risk, right? So take it, right? But this is not about the virus, and this is not, it's not going to be about the vaccine either. This is all about policy, right? And ideology and lack of clarity. That's, I guess, what it is. So governments, if they insist on creating herd immunity by vaccinations, but the vaccines turn out to be not that greatly effective in reducing transmissions, then we will be still where we are today in December, right? So that's the second possibility. And by the way, today, it happens on BBC, I saw for AstraZeneca, they found that it is actually decently effective in reducing transmission. So that's good news insofar as, since we're all dependent on our government policies, even though it's actually irrelevant, but since you're all dependent on our government policies and they have decided it that way, we all should feel lucky that the that the vaccine actually does slow down transmissions. Now, it does end transmissions, as we've talked many times, because it's not going to be durable, right? Indications from the virus itself are that the antibodies only stay in the blood for typically 5, 6, 7 months or so, right? I mean, more data will be coming in on that. And there's no reason to assume that for the vaccine, which is just a sort of a modified version of the virus or some modified parts of the virus, that's any different, right? I mean, a priori, I don't see any reason why it would be different. So in other words, the vaccine may protect you even from getting infected for a while, but then it will no longer have that protection because you're just not, I talked about it last time, may not repeat myself all the time, but it's too costly for your body to keep antibodies for such a harmless virus at all times. It's just way too costly, and the immune system is way too clever to do that. Right? It's much cleverer, obviously, than our brains. So you will eventually get the infection again, but the vaccines, by this early indication, may really slow down the virus, and it is not necessarily a good thing, as I said many times. Actually, we want to get through this as quickly as possible. We all should get exposed to this as quickly as possible. and then just get into a normal rhythm of just being, having immune systems at work, right? That's really what we should be aiming for. But since the politicians have decided to aim for some other things, it is, in their world, in their mindset, it is, very important that the vaccine reduce transmissions because they are so focused on transmissions, which I'm saying are irrelevant. But again, I'm not the policymaker, so it's good news that AstraZeneca is showing signs of reducing transmission because that's what the politicians will act on. Yeah. So if that all goes really well, they may allow us to be in early spring in December. And if that doesn't go so well, they will keep us in the fractured world, our dear leaders, right? So we'll see. I mean, these scenarios are now all just about policy making. For many months, right? Because remember, the horizontal axis severity of COVID-19, that's been settled since March or April almost, right? No, April we weren't sure, but I think by May, we already saw it clearly moving to the right. And so actually from a purely technical point of view of crafting scenarios, the horizontal axis wasn't that useful because very quickly it became clear that, the far left isn't likely, right? And you should create axes. This is just for those who create scenarios. As a technical side, an aside, you should always try to create scenarios where each quadrant is, to start with, more or less equally plausible, right? And I think it was when we started, but very quickly then already we saw we were moving to the right because the virus has turned out to be pretty harmless and pretty quick, and we found out pretty quickly. So these scenarios have pretty much always been about policy making and not about the virus. Now, talking about that, so the idea that this is now 3B, that we could still get into those distribution battles or social unrest. If none of the, doesn't look likely at the moment, but if none of the vaccines really reduce transmission, and if people get into arguments about, for example, we accept this vaccine, but we don't accept that vaccine. So for example, Brazil said the Chinese vaccine is only 50% effective, compared to some of the other vaccines, which are 90% effective. I assume they all mean the same with effectiveness, although that's, by the way, not clear. Even though so-called experts don't seem to exactly know what they're talking about, because when you read their papers, they're confused sometimes. I think they all mean effective in preventing severe illness, which is exactly what we need, right? But I hold my breath whether they're really all clear what they're talking about when they say effective or efficacy. They talk about effectiveness and efficacy, and technically they are not exactly the same. But this is all very muddled. And in the public debate, when people talk, this is effective, I bet you almost nobody knows what they actually mean by that. Right? But my feeling from what I see is that all of these vaccines are sufficiently or decently effective, even the Chinese one, at preventing you from ever becoming severely ill. Now, I say it again, 99% of us humans would anyways not get severely ill, okay? We're just talking about that 1% that would get severely ill statistically from what we know. And we want to protect that 1%, right? And of those, I think if they can all get vaccinated, or everybody who is sort of at some risk of being in the group gets vaccinated, the likelihood for them will go down very, very significantly that they get ever ill from this. So in that sense, I think all the vaccines will be effective, thankfully, right? But I fear that our dear leaders will get into discriminatory debates about, you can travel to our country if you have a vaccination, so you have to show your vaccination pass, right? So if you have no vaccination, you go into quarantine, right? Or you stay away, right? Or it may even be that they say, well, vaccination pass, but only this, and this vaccine are accepted in our country. And all the other vaccines we don't accept. So they don't count, right? So you may still see the world getting into real fights over what is an acceptable, vaccination that allows you to travel freely, right? Yeah, so I talked about the AZ vaccine having not been tested on 65 years plus, and therefore in the EU currently not being administered to those who actually need it. So you know, and then the UK, which remember is no longer part of the EU, so it's outside the EU now. Immediately saying, oh, but we think it's safe. We think it's safe. But, yeah, well, it wasn't tested, but we think it's safe. I also think it's safe. I happen to agree with the policymakers on that. I see no reason why it wouldn't be safe or effective, by the way, on the 65 plus. But it is true that they failed to test for it, right? So you do wonder, well, what is all this testing for? Right? Anyway, so yeah, AstraZeneca got their thing out quickly. Why? Because they went the easy route. Let's be very honest here. Now it's in a way, it's our policymakers who now decide, do they accept that easy way out or not? And it is nationalistic, right? The Brits say, oh, AstraZeneca, their main production is in Britain, so yes, we allow it. Oh, and we were the quickest to approve it. Yeah, because they didn't ask any tough questions, obviously, right? That's easy to approve. I could have approved it last year without asking any questions. So yeah, they approved it, but they didn't. Oh, doesn't test on 65, but that's okay, right? And the EU is slightly different and says, no, we do care about whether it was tested on the 65-year-old. So there are slightly different, ways of, approving it. But you get into a situation where Britain says we will administer it to 65 years and older, and the EU says we will not. Yeah, and already you're starting to see it's not a war yet, but you're starting to see those fractures and ruptures coming up even stronger about what makes an acceptable, vaccination. And vaccination now, it's not about saving you anymore. It's about, have you checked off the thing on your, passport so that you're allowed to behave like an adult? It's your passport to now being treated as like children at the moment. This is your passport to becoming an adult again, right? So yeah, and different countries have different definitions of what's an adult, apparently, or what's a person who is allowed to travel. I don't want to linger on this too much because every time I talk about this travel thing, but I'd say, nevertheless, one more time, there was absolutely no need to start with ever to close any borders, right? That's complete nonsense, right? And now we'll be fighting for months and months and maybe years to slowly reopen borders that we never had to close in the first place. Right? Oh my gosh, this will be fun. This is masochism, right? Self-flagellation, like the medieval monks. Yeah, that's what we're doing, self-flagellating here every day. Okay, so there is still a scenario that in December we will be even deeper in the fractured world because of severe disagreements, misalignments, fractures among countries, even EU and UK, which are so close, right? Until 3 months ago, the UK and the EU would have had the same regime. But of course, they bailed out of that. Fine, good for them. We'll see. But so even within Europe, you will have fault lines running through. Even within the EU, there may still be nationalistic, one country somehow believing they know better than the next, right? I mean, which on average cannot possibly be true, right? Anyway, so yeah, we could go further down and hold your breath. In the longer term, we could, and I said this before, but I say it again, we could even yet move into the abyss. In other words, our policies could still make the whole situation worse by not only by poor policy and making our livelihoods bad and so on, but by making the virus actually more dangerous. Border closures, I've argued for a long time, will incentivize diversification of the virus. So we will have more and more mutants, which happen naturally anyways. But if you close off ecosystems, and each ecosystem will then have their own varieties, and so we will have a proliferation of variations of this virus, far more compared to if we just open the borders and the same viruses could move around the world freely everywhere, right? So by closing borders, we are creating so-called evolutionary pressure on the virus to mutate. And as I also said, if we keep people too long away from being able to expose their immune systems to the virus, and the virus keeps changing all the time, we need to engage with this virus. The sooner the better, except for that 1% who may have a real problem. I accept that, but all others would be better off to get exposed to the virus faster, right, rather than slower. So holding it back is not a good idea for the vast majority of us. And it may still drive up IFR. So if the vaccine rollout is slow and the suppression remains in place long enough in a sufficient number of significant countries, we may see the infection fatality rate, which you would naturally expect to trend down. I said this before, the virus has no interest in killing us, and that's a dead end for the virus. So it will naturally tend to go away, just like with all other common cold viruses. They don't kill us. There's very few exceptions, right? And immune systems are severely misfiring. You can die you can get a pneumonia of a cold virus and then die, right? It's possible, but it's very rare. And this virus would be like that. It would trend towards ever lower IFR naturally. But by policy, by keeping people away from the virus, we may increase the IFR. And the third thing I said before is, we get older every day, right? And with this age very closely correlated with risk, right? So every day that we are being held away from the virus, our risk goes up incrementally. It's very small per day, but if you do this over years, then it's significant. Yeah. So keeping people away from this virus too long is equivalent to murder. Right? And I use these words, deliberately harsh words, because there is a lot of stuff going on in this policy that amounts to murder, right? Because deliberate murder, because these people should know that, right? They should understand what they're doing. And they cannot escape forever from, oh, we didn't know, right? Think, right? Okay, I did want to share briefly, sort of, just for the record, I know it's too late, but just for the record, what could have been, right? So in April 2020, when we started out with these scenarios, and we, as I say, at the very beginning, we did think that all 4 of the scenarios were more or less equally plausible. And we really did think that there was a scenario in which within a few months, say by July or August or so, we would have been back in early spring. In other words, that we would have immediately in March, when this thing started, we would have taken it on in a rational way. We would have worked as one across the world. Not closed any borders, not done any lockdowns, not broken any laws, not abolished any constitutions. Almost all countries now have de facto abolished their constitutions, right? Because all those constitutions enshrine individual rights, and this has all been dismantled, right? Instead, we would have made an effort to understand the virus, which we didn't, right? Most people still don't understand the virus. We would have invested in the protection of those who already in March we knew it's aged and some others who need protection. We knew that in March already. Right? So we could have, instead of locking everybody down and I don't know, treating them like children, we could have just been adults and said, okay, what can we do for those people who are vulnerable? Right? How can we protect them? I talked about this at length before, a few months ago, masks and self-testing equipment, etc. I had a whole framework of what you could do, remember? And secondly, so that's sort of protecting them from being infected. And secondly, in parallel, what can you do to strengthen immune systems? From vitamin D to prophylactic. Germany has now approved recently that wonder drug that they claim, Trump used to recover. I doubt that very much, because most likely he didn't need any medicine. He would have just, he was never severely sick, right? But, he did take that drug and it didn't do any harm, probably. But yeah, I mean, a prophylactic with antibodies could be part of the answer, et cetera, right? So I talked at length about this. So you go back to my October session, I believe, October or November. I spent quite some time on all these different things that one could consider to prevent to strengthen the immune system. Right now, you cannot. It's not perfect. You cannot an immune system that is severely compromised. I don't think you can turn it around, right? But you could have statistically, again, lowered the risk for those people. You could have done things very in a targeted, deliberate way, which the government, by and large, refused to do. You could have invested in hospitalization capacities. I mean, I'm still hearing now, 10 months into this, that some hospitals or regions in the world say we are overwhelmed. I mean, you had 10 months time. I mean, come on. Yes, it takes time to train staff. Yes, it takes time to acquire the equipment. But come on. I mean, we could at least have started in March. I said this before. Germany finally approved a budget, extra budget for hospitals in, I think, September or October. I mean, 6 months too late. And that's Germany, right? I don't even ask about some other countries, which probably have not made any investments at all. Right? Vaccines and therapies, I think that's the only area that we actually did do, and so on, right? So we could have done the right things, and we would have had an outcome where by July 2020 we would have had a relatively even distribution of the virus across the world. Not entirely even, because naturally it would never be exactly even, but we would not have prevented a more even. So there would have been less evolutionary pressure on the virus. We probably would already now have fewer variants than we do. There would have been no impact at all on citizens' rights and livelihoods. In fact, GDP would have probably been slightly higher than anticipated. So instead of slashing, 7 trillion off our GDP, we probably would have added maybe $500 billion, just in terms of additional investments that would have added to GDP in the short term. And here's the key, right? We would have had fewer fatalities. I mean, the main argument that politicians make about their approach is that it saves lives. And I already said last time, no, it doesn't. And even if it does marginally, a targeted approach, and I can't prove this, right? But it's very plausible, and to me, it's quite obvious. A targeted, intelligent approach would have saved more lives. So we would have had fewer fatalities if we had done the right thing, right? And we would have started a process, I think that's very important, a social debate about immune systems and about aging. I mean, I'm not at all against people becoming older and older if they're healthy and happy. I mean, we all like that, right? But we need to at least be clear that this aging of societies bears certain risks. One of them is that immune systems decline in their effectiveness. I mean, that's just natural, right? So there are 2 things a society can do without breaking any laws or doing anything unethical. One is to find ways to strengthen immune systems of especially the elderly, to be more, and we do some of that, I'm sure, here and there, but I mean, systematically think about how can we help the elderly, or generally the population, strengthen our immune system. I mean, I watch TV every day, and 50% of all advertisements right now seem to be about these germ killers. 99.9% effective in killing germs, has been proven to also kill viruses. Now, I understand these are private enterprises and they make money. They make tons of money right now selling people stuff that they basically don't need. But it is what it is, right? I mean, again, I'm not against private enterprise, and if people want to buy the stuff, in a way, let them buy it, right? It's an individual decision. But I do think there needs to be a debate, for example, about, is this harmful? I mean, I think governments do have to regulate certain substances that are harmful to human beings, and eradicating on a systematic basis most of the germs around you in your environment could indeed be harmful for immune systems, right? Because these immune systems are presumably just like your muscles. You have to, exercise them and they will be stronger. Don't exercise them, they will deteriorate. So, I mean, that has to be debated, right? Is it admissible that companies, and governments even splash, all these antiviral, antibacterial, anti-germ things all over the place, right? And thereby potentially affect the longer-term sustainability of our immune systems. I mean, if we have a debate about, nicotine is bad, what do we do? Alcohol is bad, what do we do? well, maybe we should have a debate about, well, all these good germ killers may be bad for us in the long term, and maybe that has to be regulated. They may be more dangerous than this virus, right? And I don't know the answer to that. I'm just saying there would have had to be a debate about this, or aging, right? It's not that we want to not allow people to age, not at all, but that we just want to be conscious of the fact that aging means, among other things, your immune system declines. Yeah. And eventually we all die. Maybe what we really need is a debate. People don't seem to recognize that we are all mortal. I mean, sometimes I look at the TV and I feel like these people think they're immortal and dying is like bad or something. No, dying is very natural. If we can postpone it, we do that. Great, let's do it. But there's no point in being fearful of dying. And dying of infectious diseases is the most natural way for human beings to die. Actually, it's much more natural than dying of cancer or heart disease or those things that are currently popular. So, I mean, why don't we have a debate about what it means to be an aging society, right? And how can we make lives of those aging people as livable as possible? And part of that would be to say, are there things we can do prophylactically to help them strengthen their immune system, in addition to just a healthy lifestyle, which obviously also helps your immune system. Just have a healthy lifestyle and eat healthily and exercise. But none of these debates I see on the television. I don't know, maybe they happen on the internet where I'm not so active, but I don't see them. On the television, I only see war to the virus. I mean, that's the most primitive way to think about the situation that one could imagine, right? Okay. Second, so that in April 2020, we could have moved straight into early spring. We didn't. Okay. Now in December, I said this on the previous slide, there was again, I think, a turning point potentially because the vaccines became available. So given that the world had somehow had a sort of a conspiracy against this virus and turning this basically harmless virus into some kind of an icon that everybody had to I don't know, to submit to. In December, the vaccines came, right? And there was a new opportunity for governments to change the icon, right? And the idol, I should say, change the idol and say the vaccine is the idol. Okay. And some of them are actually doing that, right? Because as I said before, it saves the skin and allows them, like Munchausen, to pull themselves out of the dirt that they got themselves into. But no, I mean, in December, we could have, as I said, we could have started by understanding the vaccines, which people, again, don't seem to want to understand the vaccines, what they actually are supposed to do, right? And then targeting the vaccines at those who need them and invest globally into everybody who actually is in need. It doesn't matter where they are located. We all do have the commitment to each other globally to bring it to them, right? And all vaccines, let's say, US CDC, I think, was the first to say we will approve anything that is above 50%, and I think that's fair. Ship all that are above 50%, ship them, right? And don't discriminate. Don't say, oh, we like this one, but not that one. We won't accept this one. We will only accept that one. Just distribute as it comes, fairly across the world. Maybe this sounds all very naive, but gosh, I mean, I think it would have been perfectly rational to do that, right? And then we would, in July, we would have reached early spring. And we all could have gone back to normal, meaning borders open, no more lockdowns, no more mandatory masks, no more tracing and tracking and QR coding and, data collection about your private lives, left, right, and center, and so on and so forth, right? And end of all the, breaking of the most basic laws and rights of citizens, right? All of that could have been done by July if we had just jointly agreed to use the vaccines that we are now luckily having in the best possible way. And I just, again, as I said on my previous chart, as of February, very clearly, we are not doing this, right? So we're not going to early spring in July. So I'm just bringing this here now as a record, for the record. Yeah. So, and I mean, my whole series of presentations is in some ways just for the record, right? I don't have a big audience. I think I'm down to 3. So hi, the 3 of you who are still watching. Thank you for watching. But I mean, it is impossible it should be impossible for politicians later to look back and say, oh, we didn't know. And yeah, we made some mistakes, but the scientists didn't know yet. Yeah, scientists only ever know things years and years after because they need empirical evidence, right? So of course you can't wait for the science to tell you. You have to think. It's called logic and plausibility. That's all you need. To move. That's how you make decisions, right? But apparently we are not. We're now the politicians are now hiding behind the scientists, and the scientists being very cautious people and working according to scientific principle, positivist kind of ideology or philosophy, if you like. The positivists are a philosophical movement, right? And who define these principles, that science is now adopting and accepting, and it works perfectly fine for scientific experiments and endeavors. I mean, I am not against this kind of positivism in science. I'm just pointing out that positivism is very useless in thinking about the here and now, right now. Okay, so scientists are maybe an interesting source of information and doing some studies, and when the studies become available, that's useful. But you certainly cannot wait, to do the right thing until the scientists come back a few years later and say, "Oh, we could have done this. Thank you very much." So you have to just simply think and use logic and plausibility and think about the options, and what's rational. I mean, it's just a basic rationality required. It's all we need. But we're not doing that. So. And partially we're not doing that because we are so fragmented. We are living in this fractured world, and every nation state thinks they need to fix this, even though it's obviously a global problem and not a local or national problem. I said this in my very first, actually I said this in April or May, that nation states have actually no business to deal with this at all, right? Because nothing here happens on the level of nations. Nation state is a construct that doesn't exist in nature. And it's not helpful. I mean, you might say, yeah, but sometimes it may help. Yeah, maybe, but not in this case for sure. It's just making things worse, right? Now, of course, we couldn't just abolish the structure that we're living in like that. I know it takes time and maybe it will never be abolished, or never say never, but not for a while. But even though we do have the United Nations, and we could have had an ad hoc way of collaborating. We could have just sat together and say, okay, we have a global virus here. Let's just jointly figure out what's the best response. I mean, we could have done that, right? I mean, it didn't help that the World Health Organization is completely incompetent. I said that before and should be fired immediately. And I agree with Trump on that. I agreed with Trump on that when he said that in October, right? But it's not just the World Health Organization, right? I mean, the United Nations could have been the right forum. And if it isn't, then one could have created an ad hoc forum. But this is not a problem that can be solved on the national level, right? And we have a situation now that national politicians, because they can't solve it, they just try harder and harder and harder and just make it worse. The hamster. All righty. Okay, now before I go into my data, I know some of you are just waiting for the data and saying, Matthias, stop chatting. But I do want to do a quick tracking of performance, right? Because I'm fascinated by this virus. I mean, I've really gotten to love this virus, really, because I'm impressed. I didn't know much about viruses before, this happened like 10 months ago. And yeah, it's fascinating. So I've looked at 5 criteria of performance for the virus. Transmissibility means, how easily and quickly does it transmit from one host to another. Replicability, once it is inside a host, how easy and quickly does it replicate. Sustainability, by that I really mean, can it hang on to that host species? In this case, humans, right? How sustainable are humans as a host from the point of view of this virus? Mutability, or which is another word for, if you like, adaptability or flexibility. So how easily does this virus change to further improve? This is, in human terms, we would call this innovation or something like that, right? So or we can call it maybe evolution also. I mean, how easily does this virus adapt so as to be even better at surviving and being successful, right? And number 5, we call that street cred. This being, in my theory, being a common cold virus, of which we have over 200, 4 of which so far now 5 are common cold coronaviruses. So, but there are 200 other cold viruses who are all by definition successful in that they have successfully sustained themselves on human hosts for some time. Some of them probably for a long time. So this new virus, this new kid on the block, imagine you're in the streets of New York, the gangs, and there's a new kid on the block, and the gang says, well, do we make this virus a member? Do we take him into our, community? Is he acceptable? Not like in the song, the logical song, acceptable to, in terms of being a vegetable, but rather, is it acceptable? Is this a great virus? Right? Is he cool? Right? So that's what I mean by street cred. So how, in other words, how competitive or how does it compare to the peers? Peer-to-peer comparison. I know these are not scientific criteria. I know that. So transmissibility, you see the little blue triangle here indicates on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being high, 1 being low. I would say it's a 4. It's not as easily transmittable as, for example, influenza, which we talked about this I think in October. I talked at length about the pattern, so I'm not going to repeat that, don't worry. But remember, influenza gets in like really spiky, peaky movements, very fast, moves through the population very fast, very high secondary attack rate. This virus isn't as fast, right? It's a bit more of a slow burn, but it's learning to get faster. It seems, plausibly, any surviving mutation, meaning mutation that we even notice, by the time we notice, it's already quite established, right? Because otherwise we wouldn't notice it, right? So any mutation we notice, so the so-called UK strand, well, before there was first there was Wuhan, then there was the Italian strand, or so, whatever we want to call it. Then there was the UK strand, the South Africa strand, apparently several Brazil strands. Now there's a variation on the UK strand that I saw this morning, the Kent strand or something, etc. Right? Now all of this is totally predictable. This was bound to happen. As I say, I think our policies, especially border closures, accelerate this process. But what you would expect, any mutation that is successful, meaning we are actually even able to notice it before it disappears again. By the time we notice it, it means it's been already quite successful, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have noticed it. And so by that time, so those that I just enumerated, they are all in this category. They ought to all be at least as transmittable as the original. At least as transmittable, probably more so, right? And that's usually also what we see when people say, oh, UK strand transmits faster. Yes, of course. Because if it didn't, it wouldn't survive, right? So, again, you don't need to be a scientist to understand that. You just have to think, right? It's logical, isn't it? If it wasn't more transmissible, there would be no point, right? And it wouldn't be able to crowd out the others, right? So it has to be at least as transmissible, right? So what we are seeing is this virus isn't of the most transmissible kind, but it's, for example, more easily transmissible because it uses the upper respiratory system, which is great. It's like an autobahn, right, between people. So from a virus point of view, that's a great mechanism, right? I mean, compared to, let's say, HIV, you know, or other sexually transmitted diseases. It's not a bad avenue because people do have sex, but not as often as they, you know, breathe and speak and sing, right? So, so compared to HIV, for example, it's much more transmissible, right? Compared to influenza, which uses the same mechanism but has been around for a long time, it's not yet at the same level of transmissibility as, and it may never be exactly, right? But we can imagine that over time, it will trend towards a 5. With every new mutation, it will get ever more transmissible. So it's doing well. Replicability, also a 4. It's sometimes by accident. From the point of view of the virus, it's an accident that sometimes it gets into the lung. It doesn't actually need to go there because it's much harder to transmit out of the lung. It's not impossible, but it's harder. So it's almost like a dead end from a point of view of the virus. It may allow it to survive longer, so there is maybe some benefit to the virus of you know, sticking there. But if it can transmit from there, then it's not very effective. Yeah. So the most effective for the virus would be to just be up here in the upper respiratory system and then transmit very fast. That would be the ideal mechanism, and that's exactly what all the common cold viruses do. Right? That's why they're not dangerous to us, because they've learned that it doesn't make sense to go down here, right? We just stay up here and transmit as fast as we can. So the good news about the increased transmissibility of new strands may be that they then have even less an incentive or even take the time to go further down, right? Now that's not clear yet whether that's really the case, but I mean, one could imagine that, right? So from the point of view of the virus, ideal replicability would be they have enough, they get in, right? They must be able to colonize your upper respiratory system. If your immune system is so strong that they don't get in, that's bad for them, right? They must get in, and they probably will often enough, and they need to have enough time before your immune system really hits them. They need to have enough time to replicate happily and then transmit, right? That would be the ideal scenario. And I think at the moment, the replicability is not yet a 5, but we may, just like the transmissibility may be trending to a 5, replicability may also be trending to a 5. So which to some degree also means it will have less and less incentive to go down here. Because if the replication up here works wonderfully, that's what it's going to do. Right? So there's, in some ways, there's a question whether there's another problem with us fighting it at this level, whether that's actually a bad idea, because it may force the virus further down, right, to hide. Right, so that, I mean, this is a complicated thing. I haven't thought about this. Where it just came to my mind that, you know, we wanted to replicate up here easily and happily, and out, done. Right? Normally, common cold takes like 7 days, right, or maybe 10 days, and then, you know, and the body has to get through it. You feel a bit lousy maybe for a day or two, a bit of a headache. It's like fever, okay, you know, coughing. Yeah, it's not pleasant, and we have it 2 or 3 times a year, but that's it, right? We can happily live with that, and we've lived with that for, you know, thousands, if not millions of years. Right? And the viruses, all these common cold viruses, they can live happily with that also. In northern climates, or, you know, far away from the equator, or non-tropical, they have a seasonality just because human and, you know, general life is seasonal, right? So they've adapted to that seasonality. But otherwise, you know, if they are near the equator or they're in a tropical zone, then maybe they don't have that seasonality, but, you know, they've just adapted perfectly to their host. And that's actually the ideal equilibrium, right? So fingers crossed that, you know, this virus will be just like that, right? It will have high transmissibility, high replicability, and that brings me to the next point, it will have high sustainability. It already looks very much now that it's very good at sticking to us. It's a very smart virus. It's learned very quickly. And, you know, I didn't know anything about how long does it maybe take a virus to adapt to a new host. And we saw the so-called SARS-1 not being able to adapt to humans fast enough, and it disappeared again. Right? So this is not trivial from the point of view of the virus to become sustainable in a host that they've chosen. They don't really choose actively, right? They just do. They do and see what happens. Right? It's trial and error in nature. So the trial and error got them to humans, and they were surprisingly good at sticking to humans. Right? Probably means that they were coming from another organism that is not that dissimilar to humans. So probably a mammal, right? Because otherwise, it would be very surprising how quickly they learn to live with us. But yeah, their sustainability is already very high, and it will trend towards a 5. So the virus will be 5, 5, 5. Almost, yeah. And it is mind-boggling that clearly the virus is quicker adjusting to us than we are in adjusting to the virus. I mean, we are so proud of our brain power. We're the biggest brains in the universe, we think. Probably not, but we think. But the virus is faster. Yes, it's also simpler, yeah. But, they have learned very quickly to live with us, and they continue to learn very quickly. So when we do things now, the vaccines, right? The vaccines are the next big test for the virus, right? How well will the virus cope with the vaccines? Either it will accelerate its mutations so that new elements on the surface of the virus appear that are not susceptible to the existing vaccines, or it will just simply accept, okay, vaccines block me for a while, but I still find, as long as it finds enough new hosts to which it can transmit. So as long as not everybody is sort of completely immune at the same time, right, that would be bad for the virus, right? But that's not going to happen, right? So they will, and as I said, the transmissibility is actually quite a bonus that they can lie low for quite a while and go slow, and that's okay for them, right? They are not, for example, one of the things about SARS-1 I talked about is that dependency of SARS-1 on so-called super spreader events, right? So the kappa, the scientific value for the shape of the propagation event curve, if that's the right word. They call it kappa, right? Dissemination factor, I think was the term, is such that most transmissions of SARS-1 happen in super spreader events, meaning they happen when one person who is highly contagious at that moment happens to be in a big group of people, and then, whoosh, right? And that virus was very dependent on super spreader events, and that allowed humans to say, well, let's avoid super spreader events, right? And if you don't give the virus super spreader event opportunities, then it will already be very hard for the virus to get around. Not true for SARS-2. Remember, SARS-2 doesn't depend to anywhere near the same degree on super spreader events, right? So yes, you can close all your sports stadiums and kill your culture and performance industries, which we've done now. De facto, we've killed them, but it won't do anything in this case. It might have done something with SARS-1, but it doesn't do anything with SARS-2 because it will slow it down a little bit. Yeah, but as I said, that's pretty irrelevant in the longer run. But it doesn't eradicate it, right? Because it happily then just goes on the slow burn. So that's an advantage that this virus has, and that's probably why it's so sustainable, right? It's much harder to catch. And therefore, this whole idea of we can catch it is wrong, right? That's where the policy is wrong. Right? Why is it wrong? Because people apparently haven't understood this virus. It cannot be caught that way by closing down your sports stadiums. So you may as well open them. Honestly, I mean, we could just open all our sports stadiums, it would make no difference. Right? Yeah, anyways, keep repeating myself. So the virus is able to so I was talking about the vaccines. So what the vaccines will do is they will block off certain individuals from the virus, at least temporarily, right? Again, AstraZeneca just said, yeah, there's evidence that there's a reduction in transmission between people of their vaccine, meaning they don't even get infected and they cannot therefore pass on the virus to the next person. So the secondary attack rate goes down in technical terms, right? Good for us, yeah. For the virus, that's bad, but the virus as long as they can find enough individuals where they can transmit to, it's fine. It doesn't depend on a very high transmission rate like influenza does. Influenza is probably under constant pressure to evolve and create new mutations that are significantly different from the previous ones, so that they can evade the vaccines. So in influenza, we have a sort of a duel between human and influenza. Influenza creates a new strand, human reacts with a new vaccine, influenza, human, right? It's like a ping pong, right? Which is fine, right? And we may get into a ping pong with this virus too, but I don't think so. And I don't think it's necessary. I don't think we will even need any vaccines in the longer run. Maybe the short term, yes, they are useful. They will protect those who are vulnerable in the first instance. But as I said many times before, in the long run, once you've been infected once or once you've been vaccinated once, your risk of ever becoming sick of this virus is very low. So, one vaccine, a double shot, is probably all you need ever in your life, right? So we will not get into this arms race that we're in this influenza, I believe, right? But if we really hammer this virus with too much vaccine, the virus may evolve that way, right? And start accelerating mutations into new strands that are significantly different from the previous ones, and so can evade the vaccines. So it is possible that we get into an arms race, but I personally don't think so, and I think it's up to us. I mean, if we just allow the virus to do its thing, then it wouldn't need to, right? I think the point I'm trying to make here is this virus is pretty smart, right? I know it's got no brain, and I know the term smart doesn't apply to viruses. I know all of that, but I'm using it anyway, just for fun, okay? But yeah, the virus, it's not smart in the sense maybe humans are smart, but it is just naturally very capable of adapting and evolving, and adapting itself to us, being sustainable in us, no matter what we throw at it, right? So I think we will be throwing in the next few months, we'll be throwing a lot of vaccine at this thing. My best guess and hope is that it will not bother the virus too much, right? It will slow down, but it will still find enough hosts to transmit, and it will get used to that sort of thing. And eventually, we will just stop getting vaccinated for something that is basically harmless, right? At some point, we will wake up to the fact that it's basically harmless, and all these vaccinations are needed, right? Once we are all through once. So, and then we don't need that arms race that we have with influenza. Influenza is inherently more dangerous than this virus, because it, for example, it can severely affect very small children and newborns, which this virus luckily does not at all. So influenza is the more dangerous virus. I said that before, right? Just to be very clear, because there was this debate, can we compare with it? Cannot compare. This is much worse than influenza. No, it isn't. It's much more harmless than influenza. It's only harmful in the very first instance because it's new to us, right? And only for very few of us, remember? But once we are through that, it's harmless to everybody. There's very few exceptions, right? Whereas influenza is more dangerous. It's not super dangerous, but it is dangerous to humans, and very young and very old, right? And we are in this constant arms race with influenza, right? It is what it is. But this one, I would say, we don't have to get into any arms race with this. We can just happily live, like with all the other 200 common cold viruses, we can just happily live together. Yeah. So mutability, I give it a 4. Originally, scientists were saying in public, this virus is pretty stable. We're not seeing it mutating as much as it could. So they thought that was a positive thing, right? Scientists like stability, I suppose, right? I don't know that it's a positive thing, because actually, as I said, mutations of the virus may be in our favor, more likely than not. So in some ways, we welcome mutations. I'm only saying that what we don't want is different viruses in different parts of the world that are endemic within a closed ecosystem and become so different that we cannot travel anymore, or something like that, right? Because one vaccination here doesn't work there, and we don't let you in because you have not been exposed to our variety or whatever, right? That we don't want. That's the risk that we are going in with our policy making. But in principle, allowing the virus to mutate, that's good for us, probably. Now, there's always some risk, right? A mutation can go awfully wrong from our point of view. It is possible that somehow a new strand appears that is more fatal. It's unlikely because it doesn't really make sense for the virus, but it could happen, right? Because nature works by random generation and then selection. You randomly mutate, and then nature just waits and sees whether that mutation has a positive effect on the livelihood of that organism or not. Right? Does it make it stronger or not? Right? If not, then that mutation will have no effect at all because it will not be transmitted into the future generations. Right? But if it does have a positive effect on the survivability or fertility or whatever of that organism, then it will prevail. So it's trial and error. Right? And in that trial and error, of course, it could happen that a strand appears that is more fatal, that somehow gets into our lung more easily or something like that. Yes, it's possible, but it's not very likely. In fact, it's quite improbable because it doesn't really make any sense for the virus. So nature in that sense is pretty efficient. It tends to eradicate things that don't make sense, right? It does allow playfulness. So there's always a bit of that exuberance of, try and error, let's just, see what happens, right? And that's why we exist, right? If that wasn't the mechanism of nature, then we would never have gotten to human beings in this high complexity, right? So that's good that it is like that, right? But that's how it is, it tries out, and it will throw up things that, it will throw up occasionally a lamp that has two heads. Remember, in the Middle Ages, people were fascinated by these creatures that, It will. And is that lamb going to survive? Probably not, right? So is it going to transmit whatever genetic change that happened, whatever mutation that happened in its genome? Is it going to transmit it? Probably not, right? So don't worry, in the next generation, there will not be a lamp with two heads, right? But still, nature will every now and then throw up a lamp with two heads and see what happens, right? I mean, that's how a lot of our features evolved. I mean, they've been debating for 200 years now, why do giraffes have this long neck, right? And the answer is probably because nature just threw out one specimen with a long neck, and guess what? That specimen was able to reach the higher leaves and survive better, right? And then transmitted that mutation, right? And then, right? So it wasn't necessarily clear to nature from the beginning that a long neck is good, right? It just throws it out and sees what happens, right? And most animals don't have that long neck, right? But a giraffe, it somehow evolved that way, right? So we will have the same thing here, right? We will have constant mutation, and there will be new kinds, and occasionally there may be one that is more fatal, but it's not very likely, unless it's also at the same time more transmissible. It is not likely that it will prevail. So we don't need to be too worried about mutations. In fact, as a general rule, they work in our favor. So we would, as a general rule, we should welcome mutations, but we should want them to happen more or less everywhere, homogeneously across the world and not localized. Because if they localize, then they'll just fracture the world even more. And I don't think anybody has an interest in that. I mean, I don't. I can only speak for myself. Okay, street cred. So, clear 5. I think this is a winner. I think if I'm a member of the community of the common cold viruses, I would say welcome to our gang. You're one of us. Yeah. 2 thumbs up. It's a good one. It's a great virus. Yeah. So that's why I said at the beginning, I've really learned to love the virus, respect this virus. It is strong. Now, okay, here's a spider web diagram. It's just, you take those ratings here and you just put them as a line connecting, the 5 items, and then that's how it looks. Okay, human performance. Yeah. Now, humans, different scores, right? So let me explain my scores. Number 1. The Mussolini score. Remember Mussolini, Italian dictator, very good at trampling on any kind of normal rights of people, suspending parliament, suspending the constitution, just sort of overriding anything that previously a civilized country, so-called civilized country, would have thought was sort of normal for them, right? He was very good at that. He was, for Hitler, he was the shining light in that respect, right? Mussolini wasn't so good as a warrior, so he didn't fight so well in wars as Hitler did. But he was very good at trampling down anything that smells of liberalism or democracy or human rights. He was excellent at that. So I give, so how are we doing today on this Mussolini score? Meaning, 5 would mean we are really pretty good Mussolinis, and the 1 would be no, we're failing on this. I'd give it a 4. I don't think our governments are quite as good as Mussolini at this, at destroying basically all our rights. But I mean, I've been amazed over the last 9 months. I could have never in my wildest dreams imagined that at least those so-called democratic countries that we used to have, remember 9 months ago, we still had democratic countries, yeah, which are now gone, of course. Democratic doesn't just mean people go and vote and the government is voted into office. No, it also means, for example, protection of minorities, and most importantly, protection of the constitution of that country, and not just a piece of paper, but the spirit of the constitution, of what's written into it, right? So those are all gone, except, as you know, Sweden and maybe some parts of the US and maybe some other countries, but it's a very small number of democracies or functioning countries in which the rule of law and the constitution are still effective, are very few. Okay, so we are doing well, but I mean, if there wasn't Sweden and a few others, then I would say it's a 5. But these Swedes, they've spoiled it a bit, yeah. Insisting on, oh, individuals can decide for themselves. Oh my gosh, right? Oh, the Swedes, how dare they, right? Yeah. So without the Swedes and a few others, we would be a 5. But so I think we have 4. Now, the Stalin indicator. Stalin, he was excellent and at what is called scorched earth tactics. So when the German Wehrmacht was moving east, remember Hitler's main objective of the whole thing was so-called Lebensraum im Osten, space for Germanic Aryans, right, in the east, enslave the Slavic people who were living there and occupy their territory. Basically what Israel is doing with Palestine, that's sort of a copy of what Hitler wanted to do with Eastern Europe, right? So his whole war was not about the UK or Churchill or the Brits don't get this. Oh, we stood alone against. You stood alone because he didn't care about you Brits. Right? For Hitler, it was all in the East. Right? At any time in World War II, 80% or more of the German Wehrmacht was in the East. Okay, not in the West. Yeah? Forget about landing in Normandy. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, it was all about the East. Right? So he wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. That was his big enemy. And he wanted to occupy territories from the Baltic down to the Crimea and make it part of a greater German Reich. Right? That was his objective. Stalin, therefore, was his main opponent. Right? Not Churchill or that US guy, I don't even know the name. Hitler probably didn't know his name either. Right? He was looking east, he was focused on Stalin. And Stalin was very clever. He, he retreated. So when the Operation Barbarossa, they call it, the invasion of Russia, of the Soviet Union, they retreated because this was a massive invasion, the most massive invasion ever. Right? They had to retreat, but just like they did 200 years earlier with Napoleon when he was invading Russia, they burned everything down. Right? And Stalin was the most effective leader in just destroying everything in the past of the Wehrmacht, so that they would find nothing to hold on to, no infrastructure, no food, no women to rape, nothing. Right? So that's the Stalin indicator. How effective have we been at destroying ourselves, or we've not destroyed ourselves, but we've locked ourselves away into our little chamber so that the virus cannot get at us, right? That's a scorched earth strategy that we've been applying. So basically a Stalin tactics, right? Not to allow the virus to get at us by creeping under our desk, right? And disappearing. Well, three and a half, right? I think Stalin would have been better. For example, you know, in animal cattle herds, if you have viruses proliferating, they may cull, right? Our politicians, for some reason that I haven't fully understood, haven't yet resolved to culling. If the virus was really dangerous, they probably would have gotten there eventually. But since the virus is so harmless, we'll probably never get to that. You know? So we've destroyed our lives, but we have not yet destroyed our own being, our existence. Right? We, as I said, we are like amoebae. We are living, but we are alive in a certain biological sense, but we have no life. Right? No real life, no normal life, no human life, right? So I think we are on a three and a half. We've tried to emulate Stalin, but it's a bit mixed. China may be better than 3.5, but as I said before, China, I don't really know what's going on inside the country because there's no information. So I shall not guess. Right? Okay, number 3. Now this I call the God factor. So the claim that most politicians are making in the world is actually twofold. Some people say we must defeat the virus. Some people are just having this as a war metaphor. But I think the majority of the politicians say we must save lives. Now we, strictly speaking, can't save lives because we are all mortal and all of us die, right? So in the best of cases, we can extend lives, not save lives. Actually, saving lives, that's God's domain, I would argue. Although God, he specializes in souls, not in bodies. He only saves our soul and not our body, but you know, it's playing God, right? So humans have decided over the last 9 months, let's play God. Okay. Means we are saving lives. Whatever that exactly means, I'm not sure, but there's something there. Right? Now, how are we doing on saving lives? According to my estimate, we have not saved any lives. We have extended some lives and shortened others, and it's basically holding the balance. At least inside the European Union, I know this is limited evidence, and I know this is not very rigorous analysis, I know, but you know, we don't have data, right? And there's no rigorous analysis at the moment. It's only that you can say plausibly, yeah, I mean, some of our measures may have slowed the virus and therefore extended the duration of certain lives, which would have been at risk, and other measures have imposed themselves so strongly on society that they've probably increased fatalities, right? So it's a, you know, and how do they exactly balance? We don't know. I showed you last time or 2 times ago the data about Sweden and the EU. Sweden being a member of the EU, I've just said logically, I mean, that's sort of, to me, the most direct comparison or the most plausible comparison, you know, and I found that Sweden's fatality per capita was actually slightly below average in the EU. I also pointed out that Sweden actually slow to report their fatalities. They're always running a little bit behind. So if you look at the worldometer data, you always see it slopes steeply down, and actually then they fill it up later. I'll talk about that later on, actually. So they're always running a bit behind. So my guess is if we were to backfill properly, Sweden would be bang in the middle, right? I mean, almost precisely average. And all the other countries have had very significant interventions, lockdowns, and quarantines, and all the rest, right? And they have exactly on average the same fatality. So, I mean, that's the best data I know of that we have. Maybe someone will come up and say, oh, you should look at this and that data. Yeah, please do come up. But for me, that's the only really useful comparison that we can make at the moment, and I accept that it's very preliminary. But based on that analysis, all the lockdowns and all the measures that the European countries and also UK and US, which are, you know, are higher also, right, Canada, Norway, which are outside the EU, Switzerland are slightly lower. I accept that. I mean, whichever way. I mean, if you take those sort of so-called Western democracies, or the ex-Western democracies, which have a similar kind of lifestyle model, similar kind of civil behavior kind of model, not the same, but broadly similar. Sweden is bang in the middle. In other words, all these measures have not changed the average expectation of how many fatalities you have at all. And Sweden, by the way, is also average in terms of their population pyramid, the demographics. Because the demographics, of course, drive it. If your demographics are poor, you're bound to have, meaning you have more people above 65 proportionally, of course, your fatalities will be higher, right? So, but you normalize for that, and Sweden is pretty much just normal in every respect. So, in other words, the strategy of not destroying the constitution and the constitutional rights that are attached to it is just as effective as the other one. Right? There's no difference based on comparing Sweden with EU or Sweden with all the Western so-called former democracies. So, which brings me to the conclusion, the God factor, we've completely failed. We are awful at playing God. Now, Goebbels, yeah, Goebbels is also one of my favorites. You may recall he was Hitler's communication or propaganda minister. And I mean, he set the standard for government propaganda, right? I mean, there are countries, let me not name them today, which are, I think, doing well compared to Goebbels, and they have more technology at hand, so they can, so certain things, Goebbels couldn't do in his day, right? But he was very smart about using technology. The radio, for example, new medium to reach into every household. He loved using the radio, right? And of course, the TV, a little bit later, if he had survived, he would have used the TV just as effectively, right? And the internet and so on, right? So Goebbels set the standard for proliferation of government propaganda, brainwashing the people. Do you want the total war? Yes, millions of Germans. Total war basically means self-destruction. Right? Basically means self-destruction. And millions of Germans, we want the total war. Thanks to Goebbels. I mean, the guy was a genius, right? Okay, so he sets the standard for government propaganda and generally media, disinformation, fake news, we call it nowadays, which is almost a little bit too nice. Right? It's much more evil than just fake news. It's systematic misinformation, systematic brainwashing. I think it's a 4.5. I mean, that the governments do that, including in Western countries, we knew that, right? That they can hold it up so consistently is surprising. But what is most surprising to me is that the media in general are so supportive of it. I mean, I've spoken about it many times, how, for example, the BBC still doesn't understand the difference between a virus and pneumonia that you may acquire by being infected by the virus, right? It's called COVID-19. They think it's the same, right? They don't understand the difference between a virus being toxic versus an immune system being compromised. Right? They think it's the same. And so on. I mean, I've talked about this at length, so you know what I mean. This is a complete and utter either misunderstanding on their part, yeah? They've made no effort to actually understand what's going on, or a systematic, deliberate misinformation campaign on behalf of whom? I don't know, governments, maybe. Maybe they're all, I mean, remember, media was supposed to be the fourth power that holds in check the other three powers, but it isn't. So I think Goebbels would be amazed, right? He would have embraced all these media people and all these politicians and said, "You are all my children. Welcome. You're all, Papa Goebbels sort of pupils, and you're doing well. It's a great class, great performance." So not very, I mean, Goebbels himself would be a 5. I think, he was a genius. I think most of us are not, but we are 4.5 in terms of delusion, misinformation, bullshitting, brainwashing. And I mean this globally. I don't single out like one country or two. I mean, there are obviously countries where they're always a 4.5, if not a 5, right? But I mean also those countries where you would have expected that they wouldn't score quite this high on this Goebbels index. They are also scoring a 4.5. So this is maybe a global average, but most countries are on the right of the scale and not on the left, right? Including those which you wouldn't have expected to see. Okay, and then finally, I call this the Einstein value. What is that? Einstein is supposed to have said, or was cited by someone to have said something along the lines of, there are two things that are infinite: the universe and human stupidity. But about the universe, I'm not quite certain yet. So the Einstein value is, how close are we to unlimited stupidity? It's a 5. I have to say, I have to bow to humanity. We could not have been more stupid. I mean, at least I could not have imagined an even more stupid response than the one we launched. Right? If you had a chimpanzee somehow randomly, or this octopus that they used in Germany for the football matches, a few years ago, they had a world championship, and the octopus would predict, and the octopus puts a ball into they would have done better than humanity. No chimpanzee and no octopus would have randomly come up with something as bad as what we've been doing. I mean, that's extraordinary, right? That's extraordinary. I mean, it basically means if all our politicians had the brain of a chimpanzee, we would have done better. Yeah? If we had done nothing, we would have done better. Our measures taken as a whole are worse than nothing. Now, I remember earlier, I didn't say we should have done nothing. No, not at all. I said we should have been very focused on those people who need support and done everything in our power globally to support them. So I'm not saying we should have done nothing. I'm just saying, even if we had done nothing, we would be better off than what we've actually done. So this is a solid 5 on the Einstein value. The stupidity of humans is indeed, we have proven it now beyond any reasonable doubt, is unlimited. So this is our profile. So I think overall the virus is doing better. So I think if you were to compare those two profiles, yeah, the virus is just a more survivable creature on this planet than us. We have this very energy-consuming, expensive brain, and we are not able to use it properly. So in evolution, normally that makes that means we will not be around forever. Okay, I mean, just like the dinosaurs, when they went away, they were very successful for a long time, mind you. And humans may still be very successful for a long time. I'm not predicting that we die out tomorrow, right? But in the longer run, unless we learn to use our brains, they are a freak of nature. I mean, nature, trial and error, remember, gave us this fantastic brain. It, of course, not just like that. It co-evolved over a longish period of time. We learned to use fire. We learned to use tools, and our hands and our brain co-evolve and become stronger. So that's all beautiful. But we may now be at a point already where there's no more evolution, because we've effectively, just like we are trying to stop viral evolution, we are trying to stop our own evolution. Right? We may already be at the end of the line. And we may not even need an asteroid to drop on the Earth to eradicate us, like the dinosaurs. Actually, they weren't quite eradicated. Remember, the birds are basically the remnants of the dinosaurs, but they were pushed into a corner in terms of ecosystem, right? Basically taking to the air, Yes, they can come to the ground to nest, etc. But they're occupying a niche that nobody else had occupied. So that they were able to survive only in that niche. But in the most important niches, which is inside the oceans and on land, dinosaurs did not survive the the impact of the asteroid, right? So in doing so, they made room for mammals and therefore for humans, right? So from our point of view, looking back, it's a godsend, that asteroid. If that asteroid had not landed on the Earth 66 million years ago or so, we would not be here, right? The world would probably still be populated by dinosaurs, and there would be mammals, but the mammals would have remained small, and the brain capacity would have never been like this. So I would say that, I mean, from the evidence so far, humans are like dinosaurs in that we will eventually have to make way to something better, because we're just simply not good enough. And I don't think we will survive anything like as long as the dinosaurs did. And I don't think we will need the random event of an asteroid to get rid of us. I think we will probably get rid of ourselves much, much, much faster than that. Not tomorrow, but because there's something fundamentally wrong in the balance of, the amount of energy and, effort that goes into maintaining this amazing brain and us not being able to use it. That's my preliminary conclusion from 10 months of COVID madness, that we are essentially, in the long run, we are doomed. Now, maybe you would say, yeah, any planet is doomed, any species is doomed, any universe is doomed. Also true, right? But I don't mean in those time dimensions. I mean doomed in a future that is not tomorrow, but that is not that far out. It is just really hard to see how we can sustain what we're doing, right? Whether it's climate change, whether it's destruction of destruction of ecosystems, etc., etc. We can do that for a while, and we can replace them with something else. And the nature is amazingly resilient, of course, and we are not going to destroy all of nature. I'm not saying that, right? But whether we will be able to have a sustainable place within this nature, I think that's very questionable. And certainly the last 10 months, we have not demonstrated, in my view, we have not demonstrated at all that we are fit to survive for in the long run. Okay, this one you already know, I won't repeat. We're trending towards insignificant. Once everybody has been exposed once, either naturally or by vaccine, then the problem is, there's no problem. So the virus is thankfully a very harmless one. We are very lucky. Right? I mean, imagine a scenario where we had a virus that works, let's say, like HIV. It channels itself into your body and then slowly destroys your immune system. That's really nasty. Now we are able to hold it in check when we find it, etc. But the therapies, we are not able to do the vaccination against it yet. But it is a very tricky. That is a real virus. Virus, as I said earlier, in Latin means a toxic thing or poison. And the HIV, for example, is really nasty, right? But luckily, it doesn't transmit very easily, right? Now, take a scenario where we had the transmissibility of, let's say, an influenza virus, which is very high, it's 5 on transmissibility, and it had the nastiness of HIV. That combination, that would be really, really bad for us. And then we would really have a problem, right? I mean, the last 10 months, we haven't had a problem. We had a pseudo problem or a human-generated problem. But this virus is not a problem, right? But there could be viruses that are indeed a real problem, right? So, yeah, we'll need to be aware of that. That a real problem could one day come our way, right? But this one, it wasn't, right? So when I thought about what this phenomenon reminds me of, it came to my mind. It reminds me of this figure or this image from one of my favorite childhood books. It's called Jim Knopf und Lukas der Lokomotivführer in German. In English, Jim Button and Lucas the Engine Driver. It's one of the most popular children books in Germany, post-war Germany, the 60s. And one of my favorite ones. It's basically a story of a little black boy and his friend who is an adult man who's an engine driver. They have this beautiful steam locomotive called Emma, and they, go on a journey to find the Chinese princess, to battle the dragons, to find the pirates, etc. It's very beautiful children's story. So they go on this journey with a locomotive. It's a great locomotive. It doesn't need tracks. It can drive on any territory. It's wonderful. And they're somewhere in the desert, and in the distance on the horizon, they see this huge, humongous figure, a giant, huge man. This old man with a long beard and a hat, looks like this. And a giant! Oh my God, right? And they're afraid, right? And what do we do? I mean, if the guy, he sees us, and then the guy says, come. Oh gosh, I mean, we cannot possibly run away from this guy, because one single step, he'll catch up with us, right? He's so huge. And he says, come. And finally they take their heart and say, okay, we'll see what we can. We get closer to him and see what we can do, whether we can even communicate with the guy, because he's so tall, whether our voices even carry, up to his ears, right? Let's see. So they slowly move towards him carefully. And guess what? The closer they get to this giant, the more he shrinks down. So basically, this is an apparent giant, a Scheinriese, whose characteristic is sort of inverse to your normal perspectival, viewing, which is the further something is away, the smaller it appears to you, right? This giant is just the opposite. The further he is away from you, the bigger he appears. So as they get closer and closer and closer, the giant, so this is our Jim and Lucas, and this is our apparent giant, and as they get closer, the giant gets ever smaller, and when they finally meet, turns out he is just the same size as them. He's just a human that appears to be bigger the further away. So I would call this whole virus affair an apparent giant paradox. People look at this virus from the distance and, virus. The closer you get to the virus and look at it actually, and what it actually does and how it works, the more you realize it's just an ordinary, average, run-of-the-mill, everyday type of common cold coronavirus. That's all it is. So bottom line is, do what Jim and Lucas do, and get closer to this virus. Get to know the virus. Shake hands with the virus. Embrace the virus. Say hello to the virus. Like, welcome, right? Be my guest, right? And you will see it's a perfectly fine virus that we can live with very happily ever after. Don't get scared if it looks dangerous to you at the distance, because the closer you get to it, the less dangerous it will appear. Okay? That's the story about the virus. And why on our two axes, remember our scenarios, we are saying the virus or the COVID-19, which is the disease that derives from the virus, is manageable and moderate, modest in its impact. Okay, now you've been waiting for the data. Here's the data. Update. Last time I said we ended the year 2020 with just over 50% penetration of the world population, excluding China. I'd also, last month, from 1st of January, I'd extrapolated out to 1st of April, and the number I calculated was 71%. So last time I said, it looks like we're on a trajectory to reaching 71% population penetration by the end of the first quarter of 2021. Now, I will talk about this in a moment, but because of some countries now reaching herd immunity and us now getting empirical data as to what happens, And are they showing signs of reaching herd immunity as predicted? I had to make some modifications to my model because they didn't reach herd immunity quite as quickly as I had anticipated. So I made two modifications to remember my model is driven off excess mortality times IFR. So I've not changed the IFR, it's still 0.2% globally, but I've looked at my excess mortality. These, remember, are tricky, not random figures, but figures from just a few countries where I happen to have them. Not all countries report these figures, they don't do so consistently. My main source is BBC, 16th of July, 2020, so it's already quite old. I have a few data points from other countries that have more recent excess mortality data, for example, Russia, for example, Mexico, and a few others. But it's a patchy kind of database. I've always been saying that, right? So that's a big risk with my database. But it is the best we have. And I'm somewhat hopeful that maybe by the end of Q1, some countries will just publish surplus mortality figures for last year. So we'll finally get something meaty, right? Because right now I'm operating with mortality figures that are already like 6 months old, and they really only pertain to most of them only pertain to the first 3 months of this proliferation. So they're very dubious, right? So I'd love to get a set of excess mortality figures for like all the major countries in the world. And I'm still hopeful that at least some of them will publish that. Not all countries, I mean, China or those countries will probably never publish this kind of thing, right? They don't want you to know, but at least some countries, hopefully they will publish this kind of data. And then I can, of course, calibrate my model again, and, with a whole new set of fresh data. And it may look quite different, we'll see, right? But at the moment, this is the best I have. But what I did for the excess mortality, two things. One, I argued with myself that since a lot of these excess mortality figures are from the first 3 months, where a lot of mistakes were made. I talked about it before. I called them, what did I call them? Honest errors, right? Or honest mistakes were made, right? Not blaming anybody, but just the kinds of things that happen if something is new. And that will be reflected, of course, in the actual COVID fatalities that are reported, sort of trending down just because fewer and fewer mistakes are being made. So people survive better just because some of the technical mistakes are not being repeated. And there's a learning curve, I said. But also the excess mortality that is beyond the COVID death should also have some kind of improvement. So I actually now build in a 10% improvement in that additional marginal extra mortality that is in excess of the COVID mortality. Because remember, I'm using not just the reported COVID figures, but on top of that, where I have the data, reported excess mortality figures that exceed the COVID figures. Right? So I pile them on top. So that's why my fatalities are always bigger than the reported fatalities, because they include, up to now, they included all fatalities, excess fatalities that happened last year, on this basic assumption that they're all somehow directly or indirectly related to COVID. Right? Some of them will actually be actual COVID fatalities, but that were just simply not counted. And some of them will be other things, such as suicides going up because of the measures, and I don't have data on that, but I'm just saying that could be the case, right? Or it could be things like, certain other patients who had a severe illness didn't get the appropriate treatment in time and died prematurely because the hospital capacity was taken up by COVID patients or was reserved for COVID, these types of things. Right? Remember, in some cases, hospitals locked off entire sections for COVID and delayed other operations that were necessary. And then the COVID never really came, but for a while, the capacity. So they artificially reduced their own capacity to treat those people who needed treatment, right? So all of that may have, led to additional fatalities, right? So my argument, remember, was, all of these should also be counted, because whether they're directly or indirectly linked to the crisis, whether they're due to the virus or whether they're or the immune systems rather, or whether they're due to poor policy choices, I mean, all of those should be counted, right? But my first thing was to say, yeah, but we get better. I mean, in our madness, we are getting more effective in applying our mad policies, right? So there should be an improvement. There should be a bit of a learning curve, not only for the COVID fatalities, but also to those additional ones that I'm piling on top. So I've built in a little improvement, 10%. And I've just done it on 1 month. I haven't gone back. I never go back and recraft the whole model backwards. Right? So that just that's too much work, right? I'm just as of 1st of February, I have a slightly new method. Okay, it doesn't make a huge difference, but you know. And the second thing that I said was, okay, the other thing that was a bit too pessimistic or actually conceptually not quite correct was to say I used the entire fatality to drive via the my assumptions about the IFR to drive my infection numbers, which is what you see on this chart, right? Strictly speaking, you should only use those portion of the fatalities that are really COVID fatalities, because the IFR applies to COVID. It doesn't apply to suicides or, you know, secondary effects on other illnesses or so. It doesn't really, you know. So that extra layer there shouldn't be used. I mean, those people really die, I think, so I'm counting them as death, but it shouldn't be used to drive the, in the model, it shouldn't be used to drive my calculation of the infection level. So my using a fixed excess fatality number would have tended to overestimate the infection level. And that would be one plausible explanation why countries where I predicted that maybe by January they would already be in herd immunity, and I'm talking about Iran, Mexico, and South Africa, those three. I will show you in detail in a moment. Two of them were not yet empirically clearly in herd immunity, where you would expect fatalities to really drop off tremendously. So therefore, something in my model had to be wrong, and so I had to decide either I adjust these excess mortality rates, because I know conceptually that they're not quite right. They're too high. I knew that, right? I just was, you know, I just leave it, right? I don't want to be seen to be optimistic. If anything, I want to err on the side of being a bit pessimistic, okay, or conservative. But I said, okay, maybe that's one thing I can do. I can adjust them down. That's very plausible conceptually, so I have no problem with that conceptually. It doesn't make me any stomach ache that, oh, I'm cheating or something. No, I'm actually just improving what I maybe should have done earlier, but I just didn't bother. The other possibility would be that my IFR is too optimistic. But that I really don't believe. So far, everything still that I see, for example, what the CDC in the US used to be saying about the actual infection rate in the US is compatible with an IFR that should actually be a little bit below 0.2, not above. It should be less than the 0.2 that I'm currently plugging in. So I really hesitate to increase my IFR, right? Because conceptually, I don't see that that's right. Whereas reducing my excess mortality, I can conceptually defend that and say, yeah, actually conceptually that makes sense. Now, whether the numbers I now plugged in are correct, it's guesswork, right? So I reduced overall excess mortality by 10%, just trended it down by 10%. So in other words, if in the June figures it was 100, then now it's 90. So it's just a little, I'm just assuming that these excess mortalities early were in some ways because of mistakes, or exceptional things that happened there, but they wouldn't repeat themselves. Therefore, it should be a bit low. And the second thing I did was to say some proportion of that excess mortality is due to COVID. So these are uncounted COVID cases, just because people don't even test all fatalities for pneumonia, but do they test for COVID, yes or no? Even if they test for COVID, it is not guaranteed that that pneumonia was actually triggered by the COVID, by the virus. So they can test for the virus, not for COVID. But, so they don't always know, yeah, the person died of pneumonia, but is it linked to SARS-CoV-2 or not? You cannot be certain, right? So usually when most countries, I think, do it where they say, if that person tested positive within, I don't know, a few weeks before they die, then we assume they died in conjunction with the virus, which is fair enough, right? It is not always going to be the case, right? But it's a fair enough workable assumption. I would have made the same assumptions. I agree with that assumption. Right? So yeah. So where was I? So I reduced, but I said so some part of the additional excess mortality that's measured is probably due to real, like COVID death, that were simply not counted because they weren't tested for the virus. So they couldn't be counted for that. They are just counted as a pneumonia fatality, right? Or some other sepsis or some other standard thing, right? But some portion, I know, must be some other things, non-COVID related fatalities, such as the suicides and the other severe diseases that had been affected by the policies or by the process around COVID, right? Those, I said, are 20% of the excess. Okay? So whatever that excess that's left, 80% I say is due to COVID and 20% is other things, suicides, etc. Now, 20%, that's a bit of guesswork, but I had some data from Mexico and Russia where they actually divvied it up. They did some study and they divvied it up, and they had figures around 20%, maybe even 30%, maybe in Mexico. So, it's a bit of a guessing game, but there's a little bit of data behind it. So I used 20%. So I took, in other words, I just reduced the mortality that I use to calculate infection rates. Net result, sorry for the lengthy digression, but just I want you to know that I'm not just plugging these numbers out of nowhere. There is a bit of thinking behind it, but a lot of that thinking can be challenged. I accept that. I just, as I always say, I try to do my best. But that does have a material impact. Remember, I said the previous projection for 1st of April was 71%, and my revised projection is 65%. So 6 percentage points difference. Okay. Now, as of 1st February, the new data is pretty high, 60%, and why it's quite steep still. I think that's plausible because January was really the month with the most fatalities we probably ever have in a single month in this whole affair, because sort of the peak of the common cold season in the northern hemisphere. And I think it's plausible that it's going to taper off. And actually in Europe and the US, there's now in January again increased clamping down with lockdowns, and they will have an effect in the 1st of March. So they will affect the fatalities throughout the month of February, meaning when I give you my next update in 1st of March, there should be a visible impact from that. And that is now, that's my third, sorry, I should have mentioned, I did a third improvement, the way I project out. I've done it a little more bottom up. Before I had a very top-down way of just, okay, what happened last month? Okay, the same thing is likely going to happen in the next 2 months because we're still in the season, and so no reason to assume a big change. So I just, last time I did this extrapolation, I just used the December data and extrapolated it out. But I'm now saying, no, that is really not good enough, because one, governments are clamping down again in January, much more than I had anticipated. I really didn't think they would go back to do national lockdowns, but here I think they're not national in most cases, but regional, with big lockdowns. Right? I had not anticipated that. And I understand somewhat within their rationale why they're doing it, because they're saying now we really know we have the vaccine. We know we are being able to roll it out in the next few months. So not to now slow the virus would be wrong. Because in a way, implicitly, that also means before it was wrong, right? When you don't know that you will have a vaccine, there's no point, right? I mean, it's pure praying to slow down the virus in the hope that maybe one day we'll have the vaccine. Now, whether you have the vaccine, you know that it's there and it's going to be produced and it's going to be rolled out, it's a little easier for the governments to credibly say, look, now we really should slow it down because we then really save some lives, right? Because we know these people, if we just give them a few more months and then they get the vaccine, and then hopefully they'll be fine, right? So I can, within that kind of limited logic that governments have applied, this actually I can understand. Right? I mean, I understand the lockdowns now a little bit better than I did the ones last year. Let's put it this way. I'm totally against lockdowns anyways, but within that frame of mind, it's a little more logical. But I hadn't really thought they would. So yeah, I was a bit surprised how much they're clamping down. So basically, the months of February will see declining fatalities because of lockdowns and other measures. And also, even without that, it seems from the data that most countries peaked in terms of infections in kind of late December or early January or mid-January, in that time frame. Now, it might then stay relatively high, or it might taper off, but actually, even without any measures, I think we would have seen this curve tapering off a little bit. And then, of course, as I said before, from March onwards, you will then see the season, end of season, and then the fatalities will start coming down significantly. We know that from the Swedish data, for example, and how the shape of the curve looks if you don't intervene. So, but I would have maybe thought that in the month of February we'll still have a fairly steep curve, and then maybe start seeing the flattening over because of the government measures. It's probably going to be a flatter curve in the months of February, and so that I'm comfortable with this new projection. I think it is more in line with what we're actually seeing happening. So the previous one was too aggressively steep. And I think it's credible that the curve for January here is still pretty steep, because January did have a lot of fatalities in the Northern Hemisphere, despite the slowdown in India, which is very significant. Otherwise, it would be steeper still, right? But we also had like peaks in South Africa and in Mexico, for example. Those countries that are now at the edge of herd immunity had a last sort of explosion, probably because of new strains. Right? South Africa has a new strain, and my guess is Mexico has a new strain, or maybe one of the Brazil strains as well. So that accelerated for a short term, but then, which also means that it now probably plunged down even steeper than you might have otherwise expected. But you had all of these things in January. So January was kind of like a month with a lot of fatalities. So I'm quite comfortable having this steep curve here. But then, I think it will start tapering off. And here are the fatality numbers that go along. So again, since I'm using fatalities to drive in the infection calculation, these two curves are linked, right? I'm just showing you sort of two different angles on the same model. Okay, that's what it is. Forgot what I said last time, but now I'm saying we're going to something like 9.5 million fatalities by 1st of April. Now, I didn't used to do these extrapolation or these forecasts because they're very tricky and they never turn out to be very accurate. Just they couldn't, and if they did, it would be sheer luck, right? So I'm not claiming that I'm able to forecast this very well. But remember, I wanted to just see whether we can see at least, if not in February, then at least in March, whether we can actually see a really measurable effect of the vaccinations. Because you would expect, now that we are really rolling out vaccines, you would expect the curve here to flatten compared to my current projection. You really would, right? Now, if the projection is so poor, then we may or may not see that, right? It may be meaningless in the end because we're just not trusting our own projection enough. But I just leave it. This projection is the best we can do at the moment, and let's track how the fatalities actually develop. And hopefully we'll really see a measurable flattening of the fatalities. If not in the next months, then definitely the months after. I would really expect that. Remember, fatalities are always behind by 4 weeks or so. So the first injection with vaccinations that people get, let's say today, affects fatalities 1 month from now. Right? So that's why maybe in February maybe we won't see that much effect yet because they've just started in January really to ramp up. But a month later, in the month of March, so running up to 1st of April, we should really be starting to see a real impact. I think the biggest problem we'll have with these things is that in that month, we should also see a first tapering down or, falling down of the naturally because of the seasonality, the season coming to an end, and the curve actually anyway is going down. Right? So unfortunately, we may well see a little bit of an improvement here, but we cannot be sure, is it now really due to vaccination or is it just due to the way the seasonality? And my model isn't granular and finely tuned enough and sophisticated enough to really tell the difference. And I'm not spending all my life, doing modeling here. Actually, there are experts out there who do nothing but modeling. One would hope that they would be doing this, but I just do my best effort on a relatively simple spreadsheet. So I can't do that. I don't have a seasonality built into my model, for example. I'm just I'm tracking, and I can see those. You can see the seasonality in the reported data, but I'm not modeling the seasonality into my model. Right? And so therefore my forecast is, the reason I'm only forecasting up to 1st of April and not beyond, because I know it's going to fall off the cliff there anyways because of seasonality. But I don't want to bother shaping that curve inside my model, right? Which is what it would take. It can be done, it can be modeled, of course, but it takes real effort. So bear with me on that. But I think, it's obviously plausible that the vaccinations will start having that effect. We expect that. Whether or not my numbers then show that clearly or not is actually irrelevant in a way. I'm just curious whether we can actually see it. But conceptually, we know the vaccines will have an impact and reduce fatalities, at least in March, if not earlier. Right? So that's all good. Let me move on. This slide is just a recap from last time. Remember, I said 4 countries of interest. Sweden, because it's the only one that is sort of a natural curve without much interference. And Iran, Mexico, and South Africa, because they are the 3 countries that, according to my model, were about to reach herd immunity. And of course, that's interesting, because I can use, if my model predicts they're reaching herd immunity, but the reported data doesn't reflect that, then my model is wrong. Right? So this is a great test of my model. And as I said before, I will always make an effort to keep my model up to date with the data that comes in. Right? If it contradicts the data that comes in, then my model isn't working well. Then I have to fine tune it or do something. And eventually, maybe I find the model is just throw it away, craft a new one. Right? But so far, it's held up. Yeah, and I hope it's still holding up. So I'm tracking those 3 countries because they will tell me whether my model is roughly in the right ballpark or not. So Sweden, I was already telling you last time that, look, the steep decline there from mid-December, that is not real. That must be a reporting issue, that they're just not reporting the data maybe because of Christmas and, blah, blah, blah. So I said, no, there's no, because unless they had like drastic lockdowns, which they don't, there's no reason why the data could drop off like that. There's not. It can only be in the reporting. It cannot be in the underlying data, right? So I said, I predicted this red curve. Remember that I said, no, actually I would predict it would rise a bit for a while until maybe January, February, and then it's, at the end of the seasonality it would taper off. That's my predicted curve, right? For Iran already showed clearly that drop-off in fatalities that is consistent with herd immunity. So Iran so far has been clearly validating my model, and it's doing what I expected it to do, but it already has a pretty high penetration at more than 80%, right? Still having, quite a lot of fatalities here. So my prediction was, the fatalities should really taper off quite steeply, right? That's my. For Mexico and South Africa, I said, according to my model, with over 80% infection rate, they must be at herd immunity now. They must be like about to drop off really steeply, right? Otherwise, my model is, my calculated infection rate is too high. Right? So I said, let's So for Mexico and Africa, South Africa, I expected a fairly soon, imminent, and fairly steep drop-off in fatalities. Okay, now here's what actually happened. Sweden, yeah, as I said, remember, so the red arrow is what I said last month, and so last month on this date here, they had reported far less fatalities than then actually later filled back in. Like they reported 75, and when they filled in, it was more than 90. Yeah, so as I said, Sweden keeps backfilling, and I don't know whether that's because they do very thorough analyses on the death, abductions, for example, to figure out is it really a COVID thing, or whether it's just a reporting, gathering the data from different regions, or whatever. I don't know, right? But they are always running about 2-3 weeks behind with their data, and so they keep once a week they backfill, but then they're running behind again and they backfill again. And yeah, so my curve was essentially right, my red curve, but I've now just updated it. It's now a green curve. So that's now my prediction how it will look. Still the same idea, it will plateau for a while and then go down, just with seasonality, right? There's no reason in Sweden, because they haven't, as far as I know, they haven't undertaken any significant measures. There's no reason why it shouldn't be that sort of expected curve. Right? Iran, okay. So my original idea was, the fatalities will drop off, go towards zero quite quickly, but they don't. They've actually more or less sort of stagnated at a certain level of about 80 to 90 per day. Not exactly stagnated, they are trending down, but very slowly. And I thought, okay, why would that perhaps be the case? And then I realized one thing that I hadn't really talked about before, but I saw that in some recent data from the CDC California, that a friend sent me some data showing the breakdown really by age groups and quite updated. And they showed not only fatalities and so on, but they also showed incidences of infection, and also their proportion of their proportion of the overall population. So people, bottom line, 65 and older, their proportion of the total population is X, whatever that is, 25% or whatever in California, but their share of the infection incidences that were measured was only half or so of that. And I thought, okay, why would that be? Well, naturally, the elderly tend to be less active, right? They're less mobile, they're less social in a way. I mean, they have fewer probably contacts than someone who is, for example, in working life or who is a student. By the way, in California, the students were also below average in terms of their being infected. Why? Because they have clamped down on schooling a lot in California. Right? And actually, with a common cold, you expect children to be disproportionately high in the exposure, but because of all the school closures, they're actually disproportionately low. Yeah, and the bulk of the infections is people between roughly 20 and 60. So basically, people working age. That's where you see the most incidences. Why? Because these people still have to go out and work. And yeah, some proportion of them work from home, but some proportion have jobs where you cannot help but you go out and you have social contacts and you are active, you do things, and therefore you're just simply more exposed to the virus on average, right? Whereas old people tend to be less exposed, just naturally, just because of their lifestyle. And even though I assume California has a little bit of a phenomenon that we have in Europe, which is a lot of old folks' homes, where people hang together a lot, and therefore they are actually, once the virus gets into that old folks home, everybody is actually has a high propensity of being exposed to it, which has been a problem in Europe. I don't know the California situation really, but I do assume they have some degree of old folks or care homes as well, right? So even taking that into account, that there is that group of elderly who can be quite vulnerable if the care home doesn't pay good attention to it, which by now they probably all do, but in the earlier stage they didn't always, right? But again, I'm not blaming anybody, it's just a fact of life. But so there is some part of the elderly who may be actually quite exposed because of their living circumstances within the old folks home. But the majority of elderly, probably on average, they tend to have a less active lifestyle, and therefore they are on average less exposed. So that's how I explained to myself that, what we have here is, if, let's say, Iran has 80% or above infection rate by now, and by the way, this is now the updated figures with the modifications I made to the model. So this number is similar to a month ago. So basically the changes to the model have shifted everything by 1 month. Think of it that way in terms of infection rate. So the new calculated Iran infection rate as of 1st of February is actually very similar to what I had previously calculated for 1st of January. So I've shifted everything by 1 month through those modifications I described earlier. So so they're now at like above 80%. So therefore, they're clearly at a level where you would definitely see some herd immunity effect on the fatalities. And we are seeing that, right? But 80% or 84%, that's for the population entire, right? But that proportion of the population where most fatalities occur, which is the people above 65, their infection rate will be much lower for the reasons I just sort of outlined, right? They are less active, and just like in California where we have real data, I don't have that real data for Iran or for South Africa or for Mexico, but the principle is the same, right? There will be local variations on that principle for sure, but the principle is the same. You can probably assume in most societies, if not almost all societies, that the elderly are somewhat less exposed than the working age population on average, right? Whether they live at home, whether they live in an old folks home, whether they live by themselves, I'm talking about averages here. The average elderly is somewhat less likely to be exposed to the virus than the working age population. Therefore, which is the bulk of the population. Therefore, their infection rate in the above 65-old bracket will tend to be lower than in the rest of the population. So if the Iran population averages 84%, among the elderly who are most vulnerable, it may only be 70% or even 60%. Okay? So, in other words, there is still a significant proportion of the elderly who have not yet been exposed to the virus. So that would explain why fatalities will not really go up again. I mean, if fatalities in Iran went like steeply up again, then my model would be wrong. Then I would be completely up, then we would be far away from herd immunity, and my 84% would be simply wrong, and I would have to go back and probably then raise the IFR, which I said earlier, I don't so far have any reason to do that, but that would be a reason to do that. Or I would have to really reflect on my surplus mortality model again and maybe really make an effort to get fresh data, because maybe it's just simply too high, right? Those are the two main levers, right? I would have to really go back and take another close look, right? So if in Iran the fatalities went back up again significantly, I mean, there can always be little short humps. That can be. Imagine the virus. There's some province in Iran where the virus hasn't been so active for whatever reasons, right? And now it gets there, and there's a brief spurt. That can happen. That can even happen when the country as a whole already is at this kind of herd immunity level, right? Because the provinces and the cities are not all the same. There's always some degree of variation. So you can always still have, even at the tail end, you can still have some bubbles coming up, right? That some city was for some reason previously not so exposed, and now it finally comes, and it has a little mini explosion locally. And if that geography is large enough, as portion of the total, then it will show in the total numbers, right? So I'm not saying that numbers of fatalities cannot go up at all, but I'm saying if they go up significantly and in a sustained way, then my model is wrong. Okay, but really what I anticipate is that they trend down, right? But what I now say is, though they don't trend down so steeply as I had thought before, they trend down in a shallow manner. And the slope is negative, but it's a small negative number. It slopes down very, very gently, and that is explained by peu à peu, step by step,
those elderly who had not yet been exposed, one by one, they do start becoming exposed. And it may take a long time, yeah? Which means a modest level of fatalities will be sustained in a place like Iran, maybe for many months to come. Now, Iran is also seasonal, the Northern Hemisphere, so of course by April, so it will taper off anyways, but not because of herd immunity so much, but also just because of the seasonality. Naturally, it will come. But after the summer, so when we look at it again in, let's say, in September, October, it definitely is not going to come back up. There's no more backup. If there's a backup, either my model is wrong or my concept of the virus is wrong. Yeah. I mean, my concept of virus is when you get infected the second time, your risk is very small. Even if you are a so-called high-risk group in the first time, once you've had it once and you've survived, your immune system has learned to deal with it, your risk is very low. That's my theory. Right? So if in a place like Iran, in October, the numbers go up again, either my model is completely wrong or my concept of the virus is wrong. But I don't expect that either of them is wrong, but I'm just saying that that is a possibility. So that the virus, and then the virus would be more dangerous than I think, right? If it can make you severely sick again and again and again, then it's not behaving like a common cold virus. Then it's behaving like something else that is more dangerous. Right? But I don't expect that to happen. But I'm just sharing with you, those are the things I will be looking out for. You may be thinking, oh, I don't need to watch these videos anymore, these boring, long videos that Matthias is doing, because we are now done, right? We're getting the vaccinations, we're vaccinated, and then back to normal. Yeah, hopefully that's true. But it's not guaranteed, right? I mean, we still may find that this virus either mutates in funny ways or has a funny behavior of, even though we have been vaccinated, the vaccination doesn't last, and even though our immune system has been trained on the virus, it's not good enough, and we may get sick again and again and again. I mean, severely sick, and run a risk of dying of the virus. Very unlikely, but not impossible. Nothing is impossible in nature, right? So I'm just sharing what I will be looking at in the longer run, but of course that the summer is coming soon, and Iran is not going to have a lot of activity in the summer, and then we'll see. But hopefully the fatalities will never go up again. Now, what this means when I say, oh, maybe only 60 or 70% of the elderly have so far been infected, or maybe even only 50%, right? It depends also probably on cultural and social ways of living and so on. It's very hard to know how that pans out locally. So if among the elderly, there's still a big proportion of people who haven't been infected yet, it does mean even for a country that has reached herd immunity, they should definitely roll out the vaccine and give it to all people above 65. They should. I mean, they have less of an urgency than some other countries, but there's still a significant number of elderly who had not yet been infected, and if you don't vaccinate them, sooner or later, eventually, they will get infected, right? Because the virus, remember, it's not going away. Even herd immunity doesn't mean the virus is going away. It just means it will slow down significantly because it cannot find so many hosts anymore, because so many hosts at any given time have a defense. But remember, the defense may only last a few months, so there's no perfect herd immunity here anyways, right? And we actually, I said last time, to talk of herd immunity, we need to put that into apostrophes, because strictly speaking, there's probably no such thing with this virus, right? At least not on the level of infections. We will get reinfected and reinfected and reinfected, just like any common cold virus. There is, in a way, a herd immunity on the level of severe illness. So most people, once they've infected or have been vaccinated, the virus will never manage again to get down here where it can do damage. In that sense, there is a herd immunity, right? An immunity against a severe illness, not an immunity against catching a cold, which is fine because catching a cold is not risky, right? Okay, just so that we're clear. So I'm now going to track and see how this green arrow, how that will really pan out over the next months, and I'll report back in a month's time. But I'm now thinking, yeah, I can see why a country reaches herd immunity as a whole, but within the segment of the population that matters most, which is the elderly, it may still be quite far away from herd immunity. But these people not being very exposed, it will slow down, and the fatality rates will not increase again. They will tend to go down, but they go down slowly and in a sort of long drawn out, slow sloping down over many months, perhaps, until they've rolled out vaccines so effectively that it will go down to almost zero. So yeah, so for the next few months in Iran, and I don't know their vaccination program, so I don't know what they're doing there. Certainly they should be vaccinating, as I say, because still a significant number of elderly probably hasn't had the virus. But I don't know. And for the next 2-3 months, given the thinking I just shared, I think we should expect this sort of the green curve here, the green arrow, just sort of continue. Sorry for the long. Mexico and South Africa, similar case. So the red curve was what I said last month. So last month I thought, oh, according to my calculated infection ratio, they ought to be at the cusp of dropping off, right? And that's what I showed with my red arrows. They weren't, right? They were basically 1 month away from dropping off. So my model was, because of this high excess fatality assumption that I shared with you earlier, was 1 month off. So I've rectified that now. So I'm now taking basically the same shape arrow. So the idea hasn't changed. It's just changed by 1 month. So instead of saying, oh, it seemed on 1st of January, it seemed like we ought to be now dropping off the cliff. Now I'm saying, no, as of 1st of February, seems to be the point where we're dropping off the cliff, right? In both cases. And I think in both cases what happened, there was a final spurt because of new variants. Otherwise, it would have taken a bit longer for these countries to reach herd immunity, right? But because of these spurts, they reach herd immunity faster. But my model, being somewhat over pessimistic, had that point a month too early. And remember, there's another imprecision built into my model, which I've mentioned but I haven't dealt with, which is I'm measuring fatalities, but actually herd immunity is actually it takes place on the level of infection rates, not really the fatalities, right? But I'm looking at fatalities because I think the numbers are much more precise than any kind of assumptions about the. So my calculation of the infection rate is just derivative. Right? My raw data is all about fatality. Because the reporting of fatalities, which is the raw data that goes into the model every month, is much more precise. It's not correct, but it's much more close to correct than the reporting of registered cases, which is all over the place. Right? It depends on your PCR testing strategy, and every country is different. Right? Some countries do almost no testing, so therefore they don't report cases, right? Etc. And some countries know the cases but don't report them, like China. Right? So yeah, China is so severe that I take it out of the model. But all the other countries in the model also have problems with the reported incidents are not very useful. Right? That's why I'm driving the whole model of fatalities, because it's much closer to the truth than the reported cases. Okay, got that right. But herd immunity as a concept, of course, takes place on the level of infections and not on the level of fatalities. The fatalities come 1 month later. So if I say Iran reached the peak of fatalities here in, like, let's say, looks like in late November, their peak of infections would have been 4 weeks earlier. Yeah. So if I'm saying Mexico is just now reaching or has just passed the peak of fatalities, means they passed the peak of infections about a month ago. Similar in Africa. Just keep that in mind. I've not built that 1 month delay into my model. I'm just talking about fatalities as if they are mirror, as if they mirror the infections, but actually they mirror the infections with 1 month's delay. Okay, but I mean, it would probably not be very difficult to build that into my model now, but I just haven't. But sorry, just to go back. So the green curves here that you see here, I'll bring them back next month and we'll see what happened, okay? Now, looking ahead, Iran. So Iran, what I just said is interesting to me. Based on that theory that I sort of put together just now, where I said, the elderly, they're still not that penetrated. And so we will, at a certain low level, at least as long as the season is still going on until let's say late March or so, we do expect, a relatively constant, maybe slightly decreasing level of fatalities, fairly sort of drawn out. So that's on the right. That's my, green arrow here from the fatalities. That the chart here on the right is the same chart as the one on the previous page. Here, the top right here, that's Iran fatalities. This one on the right is the same chart. Okay. Now on the left, I pasted the reported infections. Normally, I don't deal with infections, as I just said, but in this case, I do have a curiosity, namely, if my theory is right that people only get protected from reinfection for a limited amount of time, maybe 4, 5, 6 months, 6, 7, 8 months, meaning those people who got infected in the previous seasonality, meaning in March, April, they are already now susceptible to being reinfected, right? Which means, as I just said previously, there will never be such a thing as real herd immunity in the sense that infections will just go very low. Because the people who got infected 6 months ago, they are now already again susceptible, so they could be infected again. And so you have these layers. You have a seasonality, but you have always a sort of a mid-level of activity. There's always some proportion of the population is currently immune because they had been infected recently, and there's some proportion of the population that is already no longer immune, right? And because the seasonality cycles, the virus will align with that, actually, most people will be susceptible in most periods that matter most to the virus, which is the seasonality, where they really proliferate. So actually, the amount of infections we could measure if we were bothering to still measure them in the future, which I would argue is no need to do, but governments being what they are, they'll probably diligently track SARS-CoV-2 infections now for the next decades to come, even though it's completely rubbish, probably totally unnecessary, right? But if you try to predict what they will be actually not that much lower than what we experienced in the first year, right? Because if most people get infected during the seasonal cycle, and that's the case at least in Northern Hemisphere, in tropical countries it's more evenly distributed, or it may be more the little seasonalities, little way, not like the big seasonalities, but let's say Northern Hemisphere countries, those people who get infected last winter, they can be infected again this winter, right? So when it really matters most to the numbers, people will be susceptible at that point, right? Because most people get infected during the season, therefore they're susceptible again the next season. Because the way our immune system is based is they say, okay, I protect you for the next few months, meaning within the same seasonal cycle. So if you get infected in, let's say, in early September, at the very beginning of that season, you won't get reinfected within the same season. But you can be susceptible again in the next season, next year. Right? Means the infection, if we bother to measure infections in the future, they will not be that different from what they were in the first year. There will be some, each country will be different, and we'll see some kind of pattern emerging. Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, and tropical will all be a little different, right? And there will be some local differences, but basically, there will be some kind of a pattern that more and more aligns probably with the common cold, the normal common cold pattern. That's it. So the infections will not be low, and in that sense, it's no herd immunity in that sense, right? The fatalities will be perennially low forever, hopefully, if my model is right, or if my thinking is right. The infections, therefore, are decoupling now. In the moment where you reach the first herd immunity, meaning the first time that, let's say, 80% of the population have been exposed to, have been infected by the virus, or have received the vaccine, which is equivalent, at that moment, you start seeing a decoupling. Up to that, up to that moment in the first phase, of the fatalities mirror the cases. Not perfectly, and with 1 month's delay, and the fatalities are initially, of course, relatively proportionally much higher, because at the very beginning, we didn't have PCR tests in many locations, so there was very little testing. So, proportionally, of course, the fatalities we did mostly measure, because, not all, but more likely that we measured them than here. So the fatalities will have proportionally been higher in the early stage, of course, than they are now, right? But there is, you can see roughly a pattern here where the right-hand graph roughly mirrors the left-hand graph, right? Up to now, roughly, which is what you would expect. However, now that Iran, according to my calculation, has reached 80% penetration, you would expect a decoupling, meaning the death will, as I said, trend down, not as steeply as I first thought, because of the elderly not having yet been exposed as much as the average population. So the green arrow will not be very steep down, but it will be down. On the left, the cases, they may rise, right? We're still in a seasonality. Iran is still, it's a Northern Hemisphere country. Until March, you would still expect significant activity. So there's no reason why infections couldn't rise again. They have come down here. Maybe there was some government intervention, or people got scared, and I don't know. I'm not tracking the policy mechanisms in Iran, so I don't know whether there was some measures that the government took that made the cases fall so steeply, or whether there was a change in their testing strategy or whatnot, right? I mean, those are the vagaries of tracking infection levels, reported infection levels. It all depends on policy and testing, right? So, and you can't trace that in every single country. I mean, you don't have the information, right? So I don't, anyways. So I can't really tell you why the shape of the curve is as it is, but I would expect that this infection rate, there's no reason for it to drop right now. Because you're still in the middle of or let's say it could be at the peak now and then taper off in March, right? But there's no reason for it to drop at this moment in any kind of significant way, unless there's a government clampdown, as in Europe, where I said in February we will really see an effect of the government policy in Europe. But in Iran, unless there's another sort of lockdown or something like that, there's no reason why the infection numbers should drop. So I'm hoping over the next, let's say, 2 months, to see that the numbers on the left stay up. They may rise slightly, or they may plateau and then slightly drop. And the one on the right will continue trending down, if slowly. So that for the first time, now that we have herd immunity, we should see a decoupling of the two curves. One can stay up, and the other one can stay down, or can continue to drop, even as this one stays up. It's a very imprecise kind of thingy because of all the problems with the data, but that's why I'm putting Iran in front of you, just telling you that's what I'm going to track over the next 2 months, and we'll talk about it again. We'll see what happens. Okay, Sweden. I told you I'd consider Sweden sort of the, what do I call it? The ideal country, because limited government activity. But I mean, it is ideal, maybe unusual, in that the Swedes are very disciplined and they're doing very well in keeping social distancing on a voluntary basis, right? And it's not a very densely populated country, that probably helps, etc., etc. So yeah, Sweden and Sweden. Again, I'm not saying it's representative, but it is one archetype, namely an archetype where governments do not break all the laws. And therefore, it is in some ways close to what you would call an ideal curve. If you leave the virus to its own devices and you just apply normal personal cautionary, measures, which you should always apply against, viruses, washing your hands, not being too exuberant and hugging people and so on. Now, some cultures do that more than others. The Swedes are probably distancing themselves anyway, so for them it's not difficult to do that. Whereas, for the Spanish or the Mexicans, maybe, they find it very hard. I acknowledge those differences in cultures, right? And they do matter to the propensity to the propagation of the virus. But Sweden, what we can see here is we now have virtually two full, basically we have gone through 1 year, right? From February 2020 to now almost February 2021. We've almost got, I think we have 14 days short of a full year. Meaning we have almost 2 complete seasonal cycles. Yeah. So what I've done, I've taken the Swedish curve as of yesterday or as of 1st of February and just doubled it. So this is the same graph, just twice, okay? And just connecting them where we are today. Let me show you that. So, okay, so today we are here, 2nd of February or 3rd of February. And you can see that 21st of March, 2020, that would be the beginning of springtime. So that's the beginning of the end of the cycle. And then 21st of September, that's the beginning of autumn. That's sort of the beginning of the next cycle, okay? And in between is basically the spring and autumn, spring and summer, where activity slows down and then almost disappears for a while, before it then starts coming back. This is fatalities. Remember, they are 1 month delayed, right? So the peak of infections would be 1 month earlier than what you see in the fatalities, okay? Meaning on the 21st of September, infections are already starting to rise, whereas the fatalities only start rising about 1 month later. Yeah? Okay, so that's, so it gives you the back end of the 2020 season plus, sorry, the 2019/20 season, and the entire, 2020/21 season here in the middle, and then to the right, that would be your predicted next season, next winter, except of course, thanks to vaccinations and herd immunities and all that, that will not happen, right? In terms of fatalities. But it gives you sort of a view. If there was no vaccine and no herd immunity, you would get this kind of cycle, right? So you get sort of a picture of the cycle, and here's the green line is roughly how it looks. The green, and put the fatalities here in the early stage on the left of the graph, a bit lower than the reported, arguing that probably 20% or maybe even 30% in some cases of fatalities were unnecessary, and they would not repeat themselves. They were like first-time mistakes. Such as Sweden not taking care of their old folks' homes very well and missing, missing to equip them in time so that they could deal with the situation better, right? So mistakes were made in Sweden, right? As I said before. So you would have had some fatalities early there that would not repeat themselves. So that's why I made it a bit lower. And then here where we are now, you can now kind of say, if you connect the two curves, last year's curve as a proxy and the actual current curve, you can see how they roughly connect. And you would see that, there would be some peak of fatalities somewhere around now. Yeah, and then in February, then it starts tapering off, and then in March, then it really comes down, right? So just to describe, fatalities peaked in late March 2020, then the previous cycle, but those were inflated by errors, and then they tapered off slowly. If fatalities peaked in late March, then the proliferation would have peaked in February. Now, this was the beginning of the propagation of this virus, and there seems to have been quite a steep increase at the beginning, so that there is some evidence here that when the virus is new, initially it takes a while to take off, and then it has an inflection point, and it really does get a little bit exponential maybe for a while, and then it, because there's just, everybody is susceptible to it, right? At the very beginning, when nobody has any defense, nobody has ever been infected before, the virus just finds people everywhere around them, and so there could really at the beginning be that exponential curve for a little while. Now, this curve that is very steep here is probably exaggerated by measurement. I assume that there were fatalities earlier, which were not registered as COVID fatalities. They were just registered as pneumonia fatalities, because people that did earlier than this did not yet have the PCR testing equipment to actually realize that some of those pneumonias were actually due to this virus, or linked to this virus, right? So there will have been COVID fatalities earlier, but they're just not registered. So this very steep curve here is primarily due to measurement, right? It's basically PCR testing being rolled out in Sweden, and therefore people who were delivered in hospitals, or people who were already in hospital and were suffering of pneumonia and getting worse, they could then start diagnosing, oh, this is a pneumonia linked to this virus. Before they had the testing competence, they couldn't. Right? So there would have been people, before PCR testing was really becoming available widely, there will have been people died of COVID here that are not visible in our data, who were just simply not registered as COVID fatalities. Right? And that the actual fatalities may have been more gentle in time. So it will not have been as exponential as this, right? But there could have been in February a real, for a little while, a real exponential takeoff. Virus maybe came into Europe in December or even earlier. I mean, my guess, and this is something that maybe the scientists will model and look into, my guess is it was in Europe even earlier than December, because I picture that it initially really needs some time, because it is not like SARS-1. It doesn't depend so much on super spreader events. And so, its proliferation pattern and secondary attack rate being relatively low. I haven't modeled this, but someone will go and model this, I'm sure, and maybe find that actually the virus must have been in Europe even before December. This is my guess, that it's been in Europe already in November, in October, I don't know, September even, right? Somewhere it came into Europe, and for some time really spread only very slowly, and then there's this kind of inflection point where it really then sort of takes off, but it doesn't last very long. Then it becomes more like not an exponential curve, but still a growth curve. That's probably my mental model of how the virus takes off initially. It's almost irrelevant now, because it's not going to happen again. It's already through that, and now it's a different situation with vaccines and with herd immunity and all that. So it's a different dynamic. But I think someone will go back and try to model what really happened. So my guess is it came sometime in the last quarter of 1919, and then took its time. Then in February 2020, it really took off. And then in March, it really hit in the fatalities, because because there were quite a lot of fatalities, one, but two, because people started actually measuring, testing for the virus, and recognizing that these fatalities, these pneumonia fatalities, were actually linked to the virus and not to some other cause. Some fatalities could be linked to multiple causes, right? It's complicated, right? But I think the standard procedure in most countries is if a person dies of pneumonia and has been shown to have tested positive for this virus within a few weeks before, then we just simply assume that this pneumonia fatality is linked to the virus. As I said earlier, I'm okay with that definition, right? It's pragmatic. Okay, so then you have a naturally low activity in summer. Now, Sweden didn't constrain people very much in summer, so this is a fairly natural thing. However, Swedes love to travel to the south in summer in big numbers to the coasts of, to the beaches of Spain or Italy or whatnot. And because not Sweden closed the borders, but some other countries, many other countries closed the borders, that travel activity of the Swedes will have been significantly reduced. And so therefore this curve is probably lower than it would have been in a natural behavior. Not because Sweden had those measures, but everybody else had those measures, right? And so the Swedes couldn't go anywhere. They stayed in their own country, went to their little weekend house or holiday house that many of them have in the countryside where they're very isolated. And that, of course, makes for very slow viral transmission. If they had traveled normally and mingled happily on the beaches of Ibiza, there would have been more activity, right? So this very low summer activity is a little bit unnatural, even though Sweden didn't clamp down very much, but other countries did. And so that had an impact on the Swedes' summer vacation behavior, presumably. I haven't got the data, but I'm pretty sure that is so, right? So some activity low, but maybe it shouldn't be as low as this, right? But that was just because of policy measures in other countries. And then, coming up, and we are at penetration level 27%. So what that tells you, we are now basically, we've had 1 year cycle almost, right? So to get to herd immunity, Sweden, if it continued with the same policy and if there was no vaccine, and if there was no herd immunity, there's no herd immunity until you reach herd immunity. So if there was no vaccine, and if there were next summer, again, Swedes don't travel because all the other countries don't let them. If the conditions were like that, it would take them about 3 years. Or in other words, 3 seasonal cycles to get to herd immunity. It's just quite long. It kind of is testimony to their discipline. The Swedes have been very disciplined, right? As I said, Mexico, Iran, and South Africa probably already now after 1 year. So it took them only 1 year to get to herd immunity. Sweden, because people keep the social distancing and they do the thing, and many voluntarily wear masks in public and so on and so forth, they're really slowing down the thing significantly, right? They need almost 3 times as long as those countries which let the thing just more or less just progress, where people don't have the discipline. Government may have some measures, but they are ineffective, right? So, or even counterproductive, right? So it's interesting to note that if you behave like Sweden and you say we rely on every individual to do the right thing, we don't impose laws on you, but we urge you to behave in certain ways, social distancing, hand washing, not big groups, etc. I mean, they do have some restrictions, like big groups, for example, are restricted in Sweden. There was some travel restrictions within the country for a while. I mean, they in December, because they saw fast rising cases, they actually kept the 16 to 18-year-old students at home, away from school, which really surprised me. So there must have been a lot of pressure, because it's contrary to the logic of the government, but there must have been a lot of pressure from the opposition or from the population saying, oh, we need to do something, we need to do something. And so they did something, maybe more symbolic than anything else, but they did something. So it wasn't like there were 0 measures, but mostly they relied on individual initiative and choice to say, I behave in a way that is rational and cautious, and I try to protect others around me. Right? And they put the onus on the individual people, and the individual people did it really well. It's interesting. So that actually the penetration in Sweden now is below or just at European average, without any measures, or without almost any measures. All right, what else can we learn? So it peaked, so interestingly, the peak of registered cases so far was just before Christmas, and the fatalities peaked only like 8 days later. That's unusual. The gap between registered cases peaking and deaths peaking should be longer, but it could either be that they're still backfilling some fatalities, so that fatality will still increase and then push out a little bit to the right. It could also be that the peak of registered cases in just before Christmas is a bit artificial. Maybe people are just rushing out some testing, and of course, the more you test, the more you find, right? So, and then after Christmas, they relaxed and were busy with other things, and with the Christmas goose and so on, and they didn't test quite so much anymore, right? So that, that there was an artificial peak created just before Christmas because people were rushing out testing. I don't know, right? I'm just thinking there must be some funny thing going on, because normally you would expect a bigger gap between the peak in infection, measured infection, and the peak of fatalities. The last thing to say about Sweden here, so it's interesting, the maximum 7-day moving average of fatalities was just under 100. So both here at the early stage, where I said some of these unnecessary, but be it as it may. And then now, where we are here in the middle, again, the peak is just under 100. So the normal average fatalities in Sweden per day is about 250. Now, there may be some seasonality in that because you have influenza and so on, right? So it may not be that every day is exactly the same, but on average, you have 250 fatalities per day. Now, some of those are accidents and people who don't need any hospitalization because they just die on the spot. But presumably the majority of these nowadays would be people who also have some kind of severe illness that are suffering of, maybe a chronic, and some of them clearly need, significant hospital care, but not all of them. Yeah. So let's say if 150 out of those 250 are people who needed, fairly intensive care, not necessarily ICU, but fairly intensive care, and some of them needed ICU. You can see that from 150, an additional 100 on top, that's a significant challenge to a healthcare system. Right? It's short term, but because it is a bit peaky because of the seasonality, but you can see it does put a challenge to any healthcare system, but it's not an order of magnitude bigger challenge, right? It's still, 100 out of 150 would be, 70%. So you add 70% to your normal level, right? And even that normal level sometimes will have some peaks, right? So you're used to some kind of peakiness. But of course, if you're unlucky, this peak, the additional COVID comes on top of maybe some influenza peak, and then you're really in trouble, right? But it's all within. It's a clear stretch and challenge, but it's all within something where you can say, yeah, we probably always keep some reserve. We're never 100% utilized. So there's probably always a standing reserve of, let's say, 20% anyways. So we can use that. And then, then we are stretching, right? Then we really have to reconfigure. Can we take some people out of ICU that don't really strictly need it as much as, or do we build capacity? So, this looks like the capacity increase. You can squeeze out some efficiencies, and you can delay some not so urgent things, which most countries have done. I think this looks like a capacity increase for peak traffic of 30 to 50% might really have been necessary. I don't know what the Swedes have done, right? But but if you do that, then you're within the curve. Yeah. So I mean, one thing that tells us this whole rhetoric about flattening the curve, and we'll have. I talked about this 5 months ago, right? That people mixed up an influenza curve with a SARS-CoV-2 curve, which looks like this. Now we know how it looks, right? But the influenza curve, remember, it looks like this, right? And people in the early stage in the rhetoric, when they talked about this flattening the curve, this mantra, they clearly were having an influenza curve in their mind, even though it was already clear then that this is not an influenza curve. Which is what part of the trouble was, that people just had the wrong mental images early on. And some people still haven't, apparently even to this day, not given up on their mental images. The other day, some guy in Britain again talked about flattening the curve. I think he's talking about the UK strain that is a bit quicker, right? But this rhetoric about flattening the curve, it just doesn't seem to go away, right? There is no real need to flatten this curve, right? Yes, in the peak of the season, and by some countries, by the way, don't even have this seasonality, remember, right? So they don't even have that problem, right? They just have, across the year, they have somewhat of an increase in capacity requirements, at least for the first year, and then the problem goes away. So in a place like Sweden, it is true that in a relatively short term, let's say the 6 months from the 21st of March to the 21st of September, where you had the time to increase, let's say, ICU capacities by 30 to 50% is a challenge, right? It costs money, but it's totally doable, right? It's totally doable. Yes, you need to train new staff. That probably takes some time. That's probably the slowest part. Yes, you have to procure the equipment. You have to install it. But if you are in a rush and in March, okay, the next season is coming, right? And by that time, we already realized it was seasonal, right? At least by April, I think I realized it. So, and I'm not Jesus, right? So, I mean, anybody could have realized that who thinks about it a little bit. So we knew, okay, next season is coming in 6 months. And we know what the seasons are because we always have influenza and cold seasons, and they always start sort of in like September or in October or something like that. So, I mean, we knew all of that. We knew we had a window of 6 months to add, let's say, 30 to 50% ICU capacity. And then we were fine if we were running a Swedish model. Now and here now comes the catch. What, of course, most countries in Europe, and I'm not even talking about the rest of the world because it gets too complicated, but just looking at Europe, they didn't do the Swedish way. They hammered, right? I talked about the hammer before. It's a JoJo effect, right? You hammer down on the thing, you exacerbate the fluctuations. It comes back with a vengeance, right? Because the virus, if you artificially suppress it, it will, want to come out again, right? So you create exacerbated cycles. Right? Now take Britain. Britain, the peak 7-day moving averages of fatalities I looked it up just in preparation for this talk. In the early stage in March was about 1,000. So where Sweden is about 100, you see here, right? And in the second stage, it was 1,200, or just under 1,200. For at least for 2-3 weeks. Not just one blip, but for 2-3 weeks, a sustained level of, almost 1,000 in the early stage and almost 1,200 in this winter, right? Like last month, what we see right now. So you saw the peak was 1,400, 1,500 fatalities per day in Britain, right? But the moving average is always lower than the peak, of course, because over the week, there's less reporting on Sundays and Mondays, and the numbers are much lower. So the average so that's why I always use the 7-day moving average, right? So it evens out those weekly reporting fluctuations. So the peak 7-day moving average in the UK, we are probably now past that, so I can probably say that by now, was just under 1,200 over the last few weeks. And it, over a sustained period of 2-3 weeks. Now, Britain maybe had that special case of the UK strain being quicker, accelerating things. Sweden may not yet have that strain, at least not in the same heftiness. So that makes the comparison maybe a little bit unfair, right? I've always been saying country comparisons are always tricky because they're always a little bit on a different timeline and different things happening at any given time. But clearly, it was 1,000 early, and now it's even more than 1,000. Now, Sweden has 10 million people, and the UK has 66 million. So you would expect, all other things being equal, you would expect 6.6 times as many fatalities. Oh, and their age profiles are similar. Sweden is actually a little bit worse. Sweden is a slightly older population than the UK, but it's not a big difference. So I would just leave that aside. But you would, so a priori, you would expect the UK to have about 660 deaths if they had pursued a Swedish strategy. But they had 1,000 early on and 1,200 recently. And with all excuses about the UK strain, etc., that's really, really telling, isn't it? The peak fatalities in the UK were almost twice as high per capita than in Sweden. Meaning the strain on the healthcare system at peak was almost twice as high as in Sweden. Sweden, with their strategy, stretching out the virus by just individual responsibility, and if they did the right thing and build some capacity, 30 to 50% is my rough estimate. In addition to improvements in just utilization and managing the time that people have to stay in ICU, try to get them out as quickly as possible, and there are things you can fine tune in any system that free up capacity. And then on top, you need to add some net new additional capacity, right? And I'm saying, by the looks of it, the Swedes would have had to add maybe 30 to 50% ICU capacity, which over a period of 6 months where you had the time, I think that's doable. Whether they did it, I don't know, but I'm saying that that's what they could have done or should have done, and it would have been entirely feasible, right? So with their strategy, there was no danger at any point in time, unless they fail to invest, that the healthcare system would get overly strained. So remember those people who talked about flattening the curve? They were saying, we have to flatten the curve because the curve is much steeper, and the capacity is this, and the curve is, right? No, it isn't. It isn't. And yes, you may say, yeah, Matthias, you say that now retrospectively, but we didn't know that in March. We didn't know it, but it was very plausible to go slow on this panicky thingy, right? This panic that people created with their curves was unnecessary, right? And what I'm now saying, it may have made things worse. These people who propagated this language about what is it, shaving off the curve, they may have, and the panic that created, but we must lock down, we must hammer down, right? We have big hammer and hammer down. It may have made things worse. Now, and the UK would be an example for that. Now, there are also some other countries where you might say, yeah, but Norway or Denmark or Finland, so neighbors, their curves are even much lower than in Sweden. So, if you manage your lockdowns well, you can keep the fatalities low. So never mind that you're breaking the law, but if you put that aside, you can actually flatten the curve, right? To a level where your healthcare system, you don't even have to invest in your healthcare system. Right? Well, those countries are probably just as disciplined as the Swedes, right? So that, it's easy to put any kind of measures in place if people just go and do it, right? But arguably it was not necessary. So yes, these Denmark, Norway, Finland, they do have lower fatalities than Sweden. So the politicians may say, we saved lives. Well, they destroyed their constitutions for very small numbers of maybe lives saved, very small numbers. Because anyways, those countries wouldn't have had a lot of fatalities, right? They wouldn't. Right? So, I mean, they're so disciplined. If they had just done the Swedish model, they wouldn't have had a lot of fatalities, somewhat more than they had with the lockdown. So they managed their lockdowns effectively and maybe saved some lives at a huge cost to the identity of their country, which is now basically destroyed. I mean, they can never again claim that they have a constitution, right? Because they abolished it. So, I mean, that's a very high price to pay, where you could have managed, as Sweden demonstrates, you could have managed the whole affair quite well without breaking the law, without destroying your constitution and your democracy. And just by treating your population like adults and not like children. And on the other extreme, the UK shows if you do these, bring out the hammer and then you apply it poorly. So I think Denmark and Finland and Norway, maybe they've brought out the hammer and they have probably managed it quite well. It's my guess. I don't know the details of what they've done, but they seem to have managed the hammer. I think the hammer is wrong, but if you brought the hammer, you may as well use it effectively, right? And apparently they have done that. And the UK seems to be an example of pulling out a huge hammer several times and completely mishammering. So the hammer is dangerous, right? In the best of cases, maybe it saves some lives. And in the worst of cases, it destroys lives. And it destroys your healthcare system. Because in the UK, if the peak is like almost twice as in Sweden per capita, and let me make a guess here that Sweden probably has the more robust healthcare system than the UK, but that's just a guess, right? These Scandinavians, this is the kind of thing they tend to know how to do, right? So, I mean, the UK must have been hit really, really badly by their poor policies, right? And I mean, I would say Johnson, I mean, he's now sort of being the new Trump, right? Playing the clown. But I mean, I can't understand that kind of person doesn't step down and say, I screwed up, right? I mean, I'm not here to talk politics, and I don't care about these individuals really. And I'm not a British voter or anything, right? I'm neutral. I mean, yes, it's entertaining to have a clown again. Trump is gone, now we have Johnson clowning around. But I mean, don't these people ever take any responsibility? I mean, in his case, not only has he destroyed the democracy and the constitution of his country, but he has also killed people, right, with his policies. Not he alone, I mean, his whole government. Excuse me, he's just a representative of a whole bunch of people. Right? Aren't they ever going to step down? I mean, if you look at that, that's really scary, right? How people, they want the power, but they never take the responsibility for what they do. Or only when it's positive. I did it. We did so well on the vaccine. Yeah, right. You were the first out to get vaccines approved because these were vaccines that didn't even test for those groups who most need the vaccine. Bummer. But of course, Johnson will not say that, right? We were the first to get the vaccine out here. A vaccine that isn't yet tested for those people who actually need it. Fantastic, Mr. Johnson. Great job. Anyways, again, I'm not here to hammer down on individual politicians, really. I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson. Apologies. I don't mean it personally, right? But Johnson is a type, right? And it's this type that I just don't get it. I mean, how can the guy sleep? I couldn't. I would go mad counting the people I've killed. Right? Anyways. India, last country I wanted to highlight. So India, something funny is going on, has been going on for some time. And I just thought we need to sort of call it out because I really don't know what's going on in India. India was on a steep curve for quite a while, and I thought, yeah, great. And Delhi and Mumbai were reporting regularly on antibodies until about October, November. I mentioned this before. At that point, antibody count starts going down in the population. because those people who were infected early already no longer show antibodies in their blood. And I mentioned to you the 2 German focus studies in 2 German locations where they found that after about 5 months of people having been registered as, SARS-CoV-2 positive, so positively tested and registered, 5 months later, they already 30 to 40% of them already no longer showed antibodies. So it's known that person was infected. It's known when they were infected, roughly. I mean, you don't know it's a test done in week 1 or in week 2 or week 3. So there's a little bit of a, but it is a limited window within which the test is positive, right? So it's known they were roughly in that week, they must have been infected. And, 5 months or so later, when they measured again, and they, instead of doing PCR testing, they did antibody testing, they looked at the blood and said, oh, these people ought to have antibodies, but they no longer show antibodies, right? 30 to 40% of those who, had been infected 5 months earlier. So, in other words, we have some indications that within a time frame of, let's say, 6 months, to just give a round number, half a year, which is sort of exactly the 6 months between the cycles, right? That's why I like that 6 months thinking, because naturally, from nature's point of view, that probably makes a lot of sense, right? From our immune system point of view, makes sense. It wants to prevent you from getting infected within the same seasonal cycle, because it's quite rough, right? But it doesn't mind if you get reinfected then a year later. It doesn't bother to keep the antibodies going. It's too expensive. So that 6 months time frame, to me, conceptually, statistically or empirically, when we actually get really good measures, we may find it's not 6 months. Maybe it's 4 months or 5 or 7, right? But 6 months is probably a nice number to keep in mind. So for 6 months, you keep the antibodies ready, and then of course the number of antibodies may already decline. It's not like black and white. It's not like that, but rather right after infection, then you produce antibodies and the level is quite high, and then it starts probably tapering off. And at some point, it's so low that it's no longer measurable. No longer measurable doesn't mean it's absolutely zero, right? There may still be some antibodies somewhere in your blood, but there's so few that the measurement doesn't pick them up, right? Anyway, so there are so few that the defense is probably no longer useful. There's a point where the antibody concentration is so low that you will not be able to prevent the virus from getting into your upper respiratory system. You may, of course, then still prevent it from getting any further than this, which, as I said, is the key. But you may not be able to avoid a reinfection of your upper respiratory system, right? Okay. So Delhi and Mumbai, they found at some point that their measured antibody, proportional population that had antibodies, it went to 30%, 30-something percent, and then all of a sudden started dropping off again. And then they realized, and then they did some antibody testing. They ran some statistics on it, and they said, "Oh, it seems that some people already who should have had it don't have it anymore." Right? So that's consistent with the German data. So basically, what they realized at some point, antibody testing becomes useless. Unfortunately, it was a great tool in the first 6 months or so, but then it starts becoming less and less effective because an ever bigger proportion of people already who had been infected no longer show the antibodies, and so they don't react positively on the test. So it is no longer a good measure of penetration, right? So I don't think they even continued that program now, because it's, I mean, you can still measure, but then you have to make in your model an assumption how the proportion of people whose antibodies are already gone, how that plays. You could model it. And maybe they are doing that. I mean, it would be logical to say, we have an idea from the German studies, for example, roughly in what curve the antibody count goes down, and we can plug that into our model. And if we then do empirical antibody tests, and let's say we find in Delhi it's 40%, and by that time, there will have been so many people who already had the infection that this and this proportion of them will have already lost the antibodies, and we can build that in and calculate a theoretical actual antibody, not actual antibody count, but empirically you only find those people who actually have antibodies in their blood, but statistically or in terms of modeling, you could model how many have had antibodies before. Even if they're no longer in the blood now, they were there maybe a month ago, right? You can actually model that. Right? It's not too difficult. So maybe someone is doing that, right? And my guess is that places like Delhi and Mumbai, given that earlier data, if you just extrapolate from there, they're already at herd immunity, right? But my feeling was that a lot of India is a very big and diverse country, and my feeling was that there were other pockets of India that probably had a much lower penetration. Right? So I found those numbers very believable. That Delhi and Mumbai were on the forefront, and they were also measuring, so they were going towards herd immunity quite quickly, but the rest of the country more slowly. So, right. Bottom line in my model, today they have about 40% penetration, and in September they had about 30%. In my model, now model may be wrong, but nowhere near herd immunity. Right? So what's going on? Why, since September, both the cases and the fatalities are trending down very significantly in India? Why? So I can't explain it. I mean, there are two possibilities, I think. I mean, you would have expected, even if things slow down and there may be some seasonality or there may be some other things, I mean, there may be just a natural saturation in certain parts of the country. As I said in another talk before, 40–50% penetration, you already kind of expect to see some leveling off perhaps. And so these different effects overlay. So it's difficult to know on an aggregate of a country as big as India and as diverse what the aggregate figure ought to look like, right? It's really hard to figure out. But I'm surprised by these numbers anyways, even though it's hard to figure out what they should be. I would have at least expected in the cases that they plateau for a while and then taper off, if they taper off. And for the mortalities, they should at least take another 4 weeks until they peak before they taper off. But they peaked virtually on the same day as the cases. So that can't really be the case, right? So there must be some kind of measurement problem going on, right? So there are two possibilities here. One is that there are really 2 or 3 track India, that some parts of India, like Mumbai and Delhi, are already at herd immunity, already reached near herd immunity at that time, and start really significant tapering off, even in the fatalities. While other provinces were only slowly coming on board, right? And the third set of provinces may be quite unaffected for quite a long time. So I'm now thinking of maybe like a 3-tier model. And depending on their populations of these different tiers, you get a really funny picture, right? You may have seen a very significant drop of fatalities in those first wave provinces like Mumbai and Delhi and maybe a few others, and not yet coming on as strongly or much more slowly coming on in other parts. So, for example, in many other parts of India, people have a different lifestyle than in the big cities. They don't connect as much. They isolated villages. I don't know. I mean, I don't know India well enough to get a real good mental image of that. It is quite possible that parts of India have pockets where there's very little activity, even pockets with significant populations. Right? So one possibility is that there's some kind of funny overlaying of different, tracks of Indian provinces that leads to this strange picture. And it would, however, suggest very quickly, sooner or later it will come up again, because eventually it reaches those other places, right? So it must come up again. Second possibility is policy change or reporting change. Government just decided to report differently. Maybe India has said, oh, why don't we do what the Chinese do? We just don't report. Or we just report less. Or some provinces have decided not to report. That is a possibility, but I don't know. I don't know the provincial level stuff going on. Right? So the second possibility is a reporting change. The third possibility, which is intriguing but not very likely, India has already reached herd immunity, just like what we're seeing in Mexico and South Africa and Iran. And in fact, earlier than they. I mean, remember, Iran peaked in November. I think that's very unlikely. India would have been extremely fast. And it would mean that the multiple that you would have to pile onto the death would be very high. I mean, I'm already piling quite a multiple. I mean, I'm saying the immune deaths are much higher than reported, right? But if they were at herd immunity, you would pile even higher. I think, I mean, it would be amazing to hear all of a sudden them talk about, oh, we reached herd immunity, but I doubt it. That's very unlikely. So it's more likely that this strange overlaying of different provinces with very different speeds, or change in reporting. Yeah. In the first case, if the first case is the case, sooner or later there needs to be an uptick again, right? You can imagine that it goes down a little bit, but then eventually those provinces that had previously not been so much affected, that will now be, there will be a significant growth there, and you ought to see that in numbers. So the numbers in the first model, that is correct, and the numbers cannot go down forever. They have to come back. The second one, government not reporting, okay, then it may go to zero, like in China, maybe you have virtually zero. China hasn't had a fatality since March or something, right? Officially. I mean, you can do that, right? So then the fatalities could go to zero, but it means nothing. Right? But then it would just mean India is no longer a country that reports, right? So even the fatalities then, like, I mean, you know, make no sense, right? And the real numbers could be much higher than what they report. India is just such a big country that it skews my model. That's why I'm concerned about it. I would really love to understand what's going on in India, but I'm a little bit at a loss. So I thought I'd just share that with you, and I will keep monitoring that and see whether I find new data. Okay, that was the numbers. Effectiveness of global response, I've said this before, yeah, very ineffective. 99% of the global population probably in some kind of state of exception. Yeah, we are now almost 1 year through the crisis, or through like the hammer coming down. So 7.8 billion people. So let's say 90% through. So 7 billion man years have been severely disrupted by government policies. $7 trillion US GDP apparently were shaved off last year. And this is, you know, and running, right? So the IMF is now forecasting that between the 5 years, 2020 to 25, 22 trillion US dollars in GDP will be shaved off globally. Because remember, even if this year economies rebound, they rebound from a much lower level than what it could have been, right? So we'll never make up what we lost last year. That's lost. The 7 trillion we lost last year is lost. And secondly, we are not actually yet really back to normal, right? I mean, this first quarter 2021 is going to be awful. Right? I mean, at least in parts of Europe and North America, where in California, where they're clamping down again heavily. Woo, my gosh. I mean, the economy may get worse before it gets better, right? So not only can we not make up for what was lost, but also we are still losing, right? So that would explain why and that carries through all the way for several years. That's why the IMF now says, if you take a 5-year view, it's $22 trillion that we've destroyed for no reason. That's really very destructive. I mean, I love this. I mean, you know, I said this before, when you go into a shop and you steal something, you may get imprisoned for that, right? But if our governments shave off 22 trillion US dollars of our joint welfare, they want to be applauded. They're all expecting to be re-elected by you guys. So think about it. And the state of exception that we've created, some of that we may never go back to normal. Some of the remnants, even once the virus is completely forgotten, some of the measures, you know, may never, I mean, arguably in Europe, we will never ever be able to, I mean, us thinking people, let's put it this way, will never ever be able to convince ourselves again that Europe is even capable of having a functioning democracy and defending it when the rubber hits the road, right? Or the shit hits the fan. And this virus is not even shitty, as I said, right? A little bit of shit hits the fan and our democracies get demolished like that, right? So even if the government say, oh, we're going back to normal, and we had to do it, we had no other chance, we had no other alternative, blah, blah, blah. We saved lives, whether they did or not, but we saved lives. That would be the mantra, but it won't help. Because the constitution is not something you just switch off and on. Oh, there's a virus, let's switch it off. Oh, virus is not so bad. Yeah, okay, we switch it back on. No, you can't. You can switch it off, but you can never switch it on again, because your entire credibility, nobody will ever believe again that any of the European governments except Sweden's would be able to defend this constitution. I have some right to talk about this. I went to the German army for 2 years voluntarily when I was a young man, stupid young man, partially because I thought this constitution, this German post-World War II constitution, was really worth defending. I had a real attachment to that constitution. And Merkel has just torn it apart without probably even thinking. Right? I spent 2 years of my life in the German military, which is no real fun. Thinking I would, if the shit hits the fan, and I was thinking of the Soviet Union invading or something like that, I was thinking of a virus, but I will defend this constitution because it's worth defending. I'm still a reserve officer in the German Bundeswehr, but mind you, I would never, ever now, I'm too old anyways, but they wouldn't want me. But if they wanted me, I would say, God, no, which constitution would I defend now? It's gone. And not only is the constitution gone, you can't get it back because there will be no credibility, right? You can't even defend your constitution against a virus, a cold virus, my God. So it's gone, right? So the repercussions, I think, of this event are actually much bigger than we can all fathom. They are profound. I think this is a watershed moment, certainly in European history. Some parts of the world never had a real constitution none that is in any way good, right? Some countries have constitutions created by military men, yeah. We know those countries, and or by puppet governments or puppet parliaments, those I don't count, right? Those never counted as a constitution. But those constitutions that had some credibility, most of them, at least in Europe, they're gone. So and yeah, they cannot just simply be pulled back out of the hat like a rabbit because it's just an illusion. Right? And of course, the constitution ultimately is just an illusion. It's just in our minds, right? It's like a currency, right? A currency doesn't have to be backed by gold because as long as we believe that it's backed up by government or by the central bank, it has the value that it actually says on the bill, right? That's how currencies work. There's fiat currencies. They exist just as an illusion, and the same is true with the constitution. So any constitution, in a way, is an illusion. Right? It's the illusion that we think we all agree that we're going to protect it and defend it, but that illusion is now shattered, right? And just like a great illusion by an illusionist, right? Once people have figured out how it works, then you can no longer really enjoy the illusion, right? Because you're going, your mind, I know what he's doing, right? So the effect of the illusion is gone. And the effect of the illusion that is called the constitution, it's gone. And once we've now seen what governments in Europe are capable of doing just because of some trivial virus. We can never again believe that if any serious, imagine a serious problem came along, not a trivial problem, but a serious problem. The first thing that gives is the constitution. 9 out of 10 cases, that's the first thing they'll do. Oh, let's forget about this constitution. We now have special powers because we have a problem. Even where there is no problem, such as this trivial virus, they do that, right? So imagine there's a real problem, what they will do, right? So yeah, so the state of exception, interestingly, and I hadn't thought about this before this COVID thing came about, is something that once you create it, you cannot really get rid of it. The state of exception, as I mentioned before, it was the concept developed around the Nazi rule in Germany and in Europe. And the only way to exit that state of exception was an utter defeat of Hitler and Germany. No other way would have gotten rid of that state of exception. So once you create a state of exception, boy, it's here to stay. Yeah, enjoy. Enjoy the ride. Oh, sorry, I went too far. Okay, I don't want to linger on this because you're all familiar with this. I do this every time. I mention just, huge divergence of outcomes across countries. That's why we are in a fractured world in our scenario, right? It means some countries are very far away from herd immunity. Some countries already have reached herd immunity, and some are very near. Therefore, some countries are much more dependent on having the vaccine than others. Now, having said that, I mean, some of the comments I heard from some politicians who I don't want to name, literally saying, oh, we have the virus so well under control, we don't need to rush with the vaccines, or we don't need the vaccines. So there are politicians who take it totally as a given that suppressing their population and taking any basic rights away, if they ever had them, of course, in some countries they never had them, but just keeping them under locks is perfectly okay. The new normal is perfectly okay. And in that mindset, if you say, well, we are so good at controlling the virus, we don't even have to rush the vaccines. So when I say these new normal countries are totally dependent on the vaccine to get back to normal, maybe I'm making a mistake, right? Because maybe they think, no, we are not going back to normal. We love the new normal, right? So, Matthias, you're wrong. We don't need the vaccine because we will just stay locked down forever. Yeah. So I don't know. I'm a little confused about that because I did not really expect a politician. But there are some countries where the politicians are so firmly established, they can say anything they want. They can even say the truth. Because they cannot be changed. Right? So in some ways, it can be amazingly honest about the stuff they are doing, and no matter how illegal or unfair or irrational it is, because they can't be removed. Right? So yeah, you get some really surprising. So you really get politicians go in public and say, "Oh, we have the virus so well under control that." Oh yeah, we'll see when the vaccine comes. It's no rush. Yeah. So when I keep saying that all these new normal countries, they are very dependent on the vaccine, they may think otherwise. They may say, why? We love our new normal. Yeah. But I think the back to normal countries and the muddled through countries, I think they do want the vaccine as quick as possible, and it makes sense. Even, as I said, even if you're Iran or if you're South Africa or Mexico, and even if you realize, and I'm not saying that the governments necessarily themselves realize this, but even if they were to realize, oh, we had herd immunity, at least at the level of the total population, right? It's still rational to get the vaccine as fast as possible and roll it out to those who need it or who are at risk, because a significant proportion of your elderly may not yet have been exposed to the virus. So you're still winning by getting the vaccine to them, right? So when I said earlier, well, they are less dependent on the vaccine, it's true, but it doesn't mean they shouldn't get it. They should just go and get it. Everybody who feels at risk ought to be able to get this vaccine in the world, right? In the next few months. Now, as I said earlier, unfortunately, politics, as always, is in the way because the politicians grab the stuff and then allocate it to people who don't need it, right? So those who actually would benefit from it don't get it, at least don't get it as fast, right? So we have basically a second wave of murders. The first wave of murders, the early lockdowns, it probably killed a lot of people unnecessarily because the mayhem it created in the whole healthcare systems in Europe, especially, and so on. But I think now we have a second wave of murders, which is, oh, we have the vaccine, but we don't give it to you. Nah. Yeah, first I give it to my buddy who is a police officer, or I give it to my buddy who is a military man, or I give it, oh, frontline workers. Yeah, she's only 20, but she's working at the front line, so she she's a nurse, so therefore she must be vaccinated. No, she doesn't. But, she's 20. But, yeah, so or whatever interest groups in some countries. Oh, our airline staff, we need to open up the airlines again, and people are scared, so we vaccinate our whole airline staff. Nobody's scared of airline staff, right? Those are all like young or middle-aged, wonderfully healthy people, right? So the likelihood that they, they get sick is very low. You could be infected by them. Yeah, that's true. But I mean, anybody who is really, really seriously worried about getting infected on a plane, maybe they should really not choose to go on a plane, right? Now, the plane is one of the safest places on Earth, by the way, because the airflow is so fast. Actually, it's much safer than, for example, the check-in area down in the hall. People don't think of that, but if you're queuing up in the check-in area, then you're probably, and not social distancing, then you're probably at some risk there of some kind of a group effect. But on board, the air circulates so quickly that it's very unlikely that any kind of significant quantity of, even if the guy in front of you coughs and has a virus, it goes out. It doesn't. It's much less likely to get to you than if you're in a queue in your local supermarket. So this whole idea that air travel, and I don't get it. But there's so many things I don't get. It's a long list. So yeah. So every country or every government seems to have their most favored, as I said before, some animals obviously are more equal than others, and every country has a slightly different list of who's more equal than others, right? But no country apparently is just doing the right thing. We just really analyze who is at risk by age, by gender, and any other factors, and then get the stuff to those people who actually have the highest risk. I mean, that is so easy to understand, and yet not a single government apparently is doing that. So, hallelujah, we'll see how that pans out. Yeah, I wanted to end with two little pictures. Denmark developing, this is Reuters, 8th of January, just taken from some newspaper or something, or internet site that someone sent to me. Denmark developing digital COVID-19 vaccine passport. Yeah, this is how it starts. I think we will all, for indefinitely now, in the future, even though next year people will have already forgotten about the virus, they won't remember what it was. At least if we did the right thing, it would be like that. If we do the wrong thing, then maybe it takes a few years longer. But we will now indefinitely all have to carry a vaccine passport demonstrating that we've been vaccinated within the last 6 months. Some countries may not accept every vaccine. They will specify, you can only enter my country if you've been vaccinated the last 6 months with this, this, and this vaccine. And if in your country it's difficult to get that vaccine, then, don't travel, right? I mean, maybe I'm being a bit over pessimistic here, but I mean, I'm just seeing like the end of globalization here and the end of free movement of people forever. And maybe Denmark thinks, we're looking ahead and we can anticipate that some countries will demand this. So we want to equip our citizens with this passport so that they can travel. It's probably well-meaning, yeah. But if some countries start it, it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then the next country goes, Denmark is doing it, see, then we do it too. And then everybody has to do it. And then before you know it, you've established a standard of something that is completely useless, completely unnecessary. It's just a hassle, just another hassle, on top of all the other hassles with passports, visa, online visa. I mean, have you tried to travel to Australia and do your online visa thingy? I did that a few years ago. Never again, right? I mean, okay, it's like saying, we don't want you, Matthias, to come to our country, right? Actually, I'm a human citizen of the world, and I have a right to go to any country I like at any time. Who are you to prevent me from moving where I want to move? I mean, what a nonsense, right? And now we will, on top of passports and visa, we are now going to layer vaccine requirements. I have the feeling now, I grew up in the 60s and early 70s as a young person. Okay, 60s I was a child, I don't remember. So in the 70s and early 80s, maybe that was the freest time in human history ever, and then ever again. Maybe we'll never be able to just feel like we are actually free individuals, because governments are layering more and more restrictions on all of us. I mean, the next thing will be we'll all have a microchip somewhere under the skin, and this is good material for this kind of dystopian novel, right? Except it's all happening, right? And so this is the kind of step which takes us towards layer upon layer of requirements to travel across a border that is a pure artifact, right? These national borders are pure artifacts. They have no meaning. Right? But so we'll all be locked in, right? And, I mean, I'm one of the lucky ones with a German passport. I can travel to most countries without too much hassle. I mean, I sympathize a lot with people who have some other passports where they can't even get a visa, right? And now we just put a vaccine requirement on top of that. It's going to be awful. Life is just going to get worse and worse. And I always wonder, who wants this? Who is it who's asking for this, right? And it's not just governments, right? The governments do their part, and then you have the private sector piling in, right? So Microsoft and Cigna, which I think is an insurance company, form a coalition for digital records of COVID-19 vaccination. There you go, right? I mean, mind you, next time you apply for a health insurance, where's your COVID vaccination certificate, sir? You know, I mean, this means your digital data will be tracked, right? And once it's trackable, governments will demand it, right? So this is the next layer, right? So private enterprise collaborating, conspiring, I should say, with governments to make you even more transparent, to put even more data burdens on you. I mean, you know, I don't know what else we will have to demonstrate in the future that, you know, that shows that we are, you know, a human being, you know, or maybe we are not. I mean, we'll just be a data set, right? We'll be indistinguishable from an AI, because all we will be is in the mind of the governments and of private, you know, corporations is we will be just a data set. Which reminds me of my good old friend Nietzsche, famously said, God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. And that will happen with COVID-19. When the virus and the disease will have long been forgotten, because they were just a temporary effect of a new virus hitting some unprepared immune systems, a one-off effect that will not repeat itself, not with the same virus anyways. It could repeat itself with other viruses in the future. But this virus, it's just going to be a one-off effect. But the repercussions that we humans have created for ourselves in the slipstream of this virus, this one-off event, they may be with us for thousands of years. The shadow of this God, and we've elevated a plain vanilla virus to something like a God, an idol, right? The shadow of this idol will be with us for thousands of years to come. Okay, last picture. This is a friend sent that to me who was at Changi Airport just a few days ago. It's late night, admittedly, so maybe not the busiest of times and so on, but I just love this picture. I presume these are airport employees, so not travelers, but this is how the future of mankind, this is a glimpse of the future of mankind. I mean, if we continue on this route, we will be living like, people on Mars. Imagine if you were on Mars, you would have this kind of huge, like cheese cover kind of shaped dome that protects you from radiation and any kind of external influences, right? And then, atmosphere and so on. And within that artificial atmosphere, you would maybe be freely walking, or you might have to have some breathing support on you, and maybe you would have a light, astronaut suit like these people here. And that's how you could survive, at least for a while, on Mars. Yeah, that's beautiful. And, maybe this is how we're gonna just look like here on Earth. If we don't expose our immune systems to the stuff around us, a few million varieties of viruses, for example, if we hunker down and protect ourselves from every little bit of germ that is out there in nature, sooner or later, we will have to be walking around everywhere on this planet, just like this. This is a glimpse of the future we've mapped out for ourselves if we continue on the path that we are currently on. So, Hans Christian Andersen, The Emperor's New Clothes. Maybe many of you know the fairy tale. A vain emperor, some savvy, I don't know, clothes makers maybe, or people, I don't know, they come to him and say, we have this fantastic new material. It's amazing. It's so beautiful, but only people who are intelligent can see it. For all other people, the stupid ones, it's transparent and they don't see it. And they show, bring their weaving equipment and look, look this beautiful color, Your Majesty. And of course, the emperor sees nothing. But of course, he doesn't want to show that because it might mean he's stupid. So he's like, oh, fantastic. Oh, I love this. Can you make me a uniform out of this material? Yeah, of course, sir. It's a bit expensive, but we make you a beautiful uniform out of this magical clothes. And they do. And then they weave. And finally, they fit it on. And say, Your Majesty, you look amazing, ravishing, right? And His Majesty puts on that suit that that only the intelligent people can see, and it walks around the town, right? And you see on the image, you obviously only see the underwear made of normal material, because of course the emperor has no clothes on, right? But nobody around him dares to say that, because they've all been brainwashed to think that only intelligent people see it, and if you don't see it, means you're stupid. Brilliant, right? And then the story, and then some child comes along, a little child that doesn't know anything about stupid and not stupid, and it doesn't know anything about brainwashing yet. And it says, but he doesn't wear any clothes. Yeah, and I have to think of this nice fairy tale when I look at our governments, our leaders. Right? They are not wearing any clothes. But apparently nobody dares to say that. So damn, where is the child to save us from these governments? We need a child to just point out and say, this is all wrong. Yeah, here's my thinker. I put my thinker to sleep a little bit. Don't worry, he's not dead. It's just putting him to sleep. Doesn't mean I'm stopping my videos, but I think thinking has gotten out of fashion. and I'm feeling a little bit lonely. So I've replaced my thinker with Hegge the Horrible, my favorite Viking. I think he is a Swedish Viking, I think. I'm not sure. Could be a Swedish Viking. So, with all Vikings of the world unite and, score. See you next time.